Sophie Randall had spent 3 years building a quiet life as an emergency room nurse, carefully burying the trauma of her Navy combat medic past beneath a mask of humble competence. When a critically injured Army Ranger arrived at Pinehurst Medical Center without proper insurance, the chief physician ordered him turned away to protect the hospital's budget. Sophie made a choice that cost her everything. She violated direct orders and saved the dying soldier's life using techniques that revealed skills no ordinary nurse should possess. 48 hours after her termination, 2 Navy helicopters descended on the hospital parking lot, and her carefully hidden identity was about to become devastatingly public. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency department at Pinehurst Medical Center hummed with its usual Tuesday afternoon rhythm. Sophie Randall moved through the controlled chaos with practiced efficiency, her brown ponytails swaying as she checked vitals on a teenage boy recovering from a skateboarding accident. At 34, she had the kind of face that people forgot easily, pleasant but unremarkable, with tired hazel eyes that suggested someone who worked too many double shifts and didn't complain about it. "You're going to be fine, Tyler," she said gently, adjusting his IV line with steady hands. "The X-rays show a clean break. Dr. Foster will have you casted and home before dinner." The boy's mother squeezed Sophie's arm gratefully. "Thank you so much, Nurse Randall. You've been so kind." Sophie offered a small smile and moved to the next bay, where an elderly woman was waiting for discharge papers. Kindness was easy. Kindness didn't require explanations or draw attention. In the 3 years since she'd left the Navy and reinvented herself as a civilian, Sophie had perfected the art of being helpful without being memorable. "Sophie, can you grab me 2 units of Oneg from the blood bank?" Nurse Bethany Price called from across the department, her blonde curls bouncing as she restocked a crash cart. "We're running low again." "On it," Sophie replied, already heading toward the service elevator. She passed Dr. Winston Bradford in the hallway, pressing herself against the wall to give the chief of emergency medicine plenty of space. Bradford was a tall man in his early 40s with graying temples and an expression of permanent irritation. He didn't acknowledge her presence, which was normal. In Bradford's hierarchy, nurses were interchangeable parts of the hospital machinery, necessary, but beneath notice unless they made mistakes. The blood bank was in the basement, a quiet, fluorescent-lit space that smelled of antiseptic and refrigerated air. Sophie signed out the blood units with the drowsy technician and rode the elevator back up, reviewing her mental checklist. Her shift ended in 4 hours. She needed to pick up groceries, pay her electric bill, and return the library books that were overdue. It was a life of careful routines and modest ambitions, exactly what she'd wanted when she'd walked away from the military. When the elevator doors opened, she heard raised voices coming from the main ER entrance. "I don't care what your protocol says," someone was shouting. "He's bleeding out." Sophie's training kicked in before her conscious mind caught up. She set the blood units on the nurses' station counter and moved toward the commotion, her body already shifting into a different mode, alert, focused, ready. 2 men in civilian clothes were half carrying, half dragging a third man through the automatic doors. The injured man wore torn tactical pants and a shredded jacket, his face pale and slick with sweat. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages wrapped around his torso, dripping steadily onto the clean linoleum floor. "Sir, you need to take him to County General," Paula Martinez, the registration clerk, was saying nervously, her hands fluttering over her keyboard. "We need to verify insurance coverage before—" "There's no time," the taller of the 2 men barked. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, though his clothes were splattered with his friend's blood. "Fort Bragg is 40 minutes away. He won't make it." Sophie's eyes locked onto the injured man's chest. She could see the arterial spray pattern on his jacket, the way his breathing was shallow and rapid, the subtle cyanotic tinge creeping into his lips. Tension pneumothorax, her mind supplied automatically. Maybe 10 minutes before complete respiratory collapse. Dr. Bradford strode into the lobby, his white coat pristine and his clipboard held like a shield. "What's going on here?" "Emergency trauma, doctor," the shorter man said urgently. "Training accident at the military base. Our buddy needs immediate help." Bradford's eyes flickered over the injured man with the practiced assessment of an experienced physician, then moved to the registration desk. "Does he have current insurance information?" Paula shook her head nervously. "He has a military ID, but it's expired. And there's no active insurance card in our system. I'd need to call Fort Bragg to verify coverage. But their administrative offices are closed for the day." "Then he needs to be transported to a facility that can handle unverified military cases," Bradford said flatly. "We're a civilian hospital with budget constraints. Call County General and arrange transfer." The taller man's face flushed with anger. "He'll die before the ambulance gets him there. Just look at him." "I understand your concern," Bradford replied, his tone professionally detached. "But Pinehurst Medical Center has protocols designed to protect both our patients and our financial stability. Without insurance verification, we expose ourselves to significant liability. County General has a military liaison office that can fast-track." "Please." The injured man's voice was barely a whisper, cutting through the argument. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. "Just stop the bleeding. I can pay. I'll figure it out." Sophie recognized the look in those eyes. She'd seen it in Kandahar, in field hospitals scattered across 3 continents, in the faces of young men and women who understood they were dying and were trying very hard to be brave about it. The man was maybe 29, 30 at most. Someone's son, possibly someone's husband or father. Bradford was already turning away, signaling to Paula to make the transfer call. "Get County on the line. Tell them we have a priority trauma incoming." Sophie's hands moved before her brain could override them. She stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "Dr. Bradford, this patient is in acute respiratory distress. He needs immediate intervention." Bradford turned back, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Sophie rarely spoke up in departmental decisions. "Nurse Randall, I've made my assessment. Please return to your assigned duties." "His left lung is collapsing," Sophie continued, moving closer to the injured man. She could see it now. The subtle asymmetry in his chest movement, the distended jugular veins. He has maybe 8 to 10 minutes before full cardiovascular collapse. County General is 25 minutes away. "Your concern is noted," Bradford said coldly. "But medical decisions are made by physicians, not nursing staff. Step back." Sophie looked at the injured man again. His eyes met hers, and she saw the recognition there, not of her specifically, but of someone who understood. Someone who'd been in the field. His right hand moved weakly, and she caught sight of the tattoo on his inner wrist. A Ranger tab. 75th Regiment. The math was simple. She could follow orders and watch him die, or she could act and face consequences. It wasn't really a choice at all. "I'm sorry, Dr. Bradford," she said quietly, already moving toward the injured man. "I can't do that." Bradford's face went rigid with shock. "Excuse me." Sophie gently took the injured man's arm, guiding him toward an empty gurney that Quinn Sullivan, the ER tech, had wordlessly rolled into position. Quinn was a sharp-eyed young man who'd worked with Sophie long enough to trust her instincts. "Help me get him on the gurney," she said to the 2 men supporting their friend. "Nurse Randall!" Bradford's voice rose to a near shout. "I am giving you a direct order. Step away from that patient immediately." Sophie ignored him. She was already doing rapid triage, her hands moving with practiced precision. She pressed gently on the injured man's trachea, deviated to the right, percussed his chest, hyperresonant on the left, checked his radial pulse, thready and rapid, textbook tension pneumothorax with probable hemothorax. "Quinn, I need a 14-gauge needle, a large bore chest seal, and the thoracotomy tray," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute authority that she hadn't used in 3 years. "Now." Quinn hesitated for only a second, glancing at Dr. Bradford's furious face, then sprinted toward the supply room. "You are finished here," Bradford shouted, his professional composure shattering. "Security! I need security in the ER immediately!" Nurse Evelyn Sawyer, a stern woman in her 50s who'd worked at Pinehurst for 2 decades, appeared at Bradford's elbow. "Winston, maybe we should." "Stay out of this, Evelyn," Bradford snapped. "This is insubordination of the highest order." Sophie was already cutting away the makeshift bandages with trauma shears. exposing the injury beneath, a deep laceration across the left chest, and beneath it, the telltale signs of air trapped in the pleural space. The injured man's breathing was becoming more labored by the second. "What's your name, soldier?" she asked quietly, leaning close to his ear. "Hayes," he gasped. "Captain Logan Hayes." "Captain Hayes, I'm going to do a procedure that's going to hurt, but it's going to let you breathe again. I need you to stay very still. Can you do that for me?" Hayes managed a weak nod. "Navy? Corpsman?" Sophie's hands paused for a fraction of a second. Then she continued working. "Something like that. Just hold on." Quinn returned with the supplies, his face pale but determined. "Dr. Foster is in surgery," he whispered. "Dr. Carlson is 10 minutes out." "We don't have 10 minutes," Sophie replied. She snapped on sterile gloves with practiced efficiency. "Hold him steady." The two men who'd brought Hayes in, both clearly military themselves, moved without being asked, positioning themselves to keep Hayes stable. Sophie found the anatomical landmarks with her fingertips. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She'd done this procedure dozens of times in field conditions, with mortar rounds landing 100 yards away. A civilian hospital with good lighting and proper equipment should have been easy. Except that Dr. Bradford was now physically trying to push her aside, his face contorted with rage. "You do not have the authority." Sophie sidestepped him without looking up, her focus absolute. She positioned the needle, took a breath, and inserted it with swift confidence. There was a sharp hiss as trapped air escaped from Hayes' chest cavity, and his breathing immediately deepened. The cyanotic tinge began to fade from his lips. "Oh my God," Bethany Price whispered from somewhere behind them. "How did she know where to—" "Call Malcolm Forrester," Bradford ordered, his voice shaking. "Get the hospital administrator down here immediately. And get Security Chief Cooper. I want this woman removed from the premises." Sophie was already applying the chest seal, her movements economical and sure. She'd bought Hayes time, but he still needed surgery to repair whatever was bleeding inside his chest cavity. "Captain Hayes, you're stabilized. We're going to get you into an operating room." Hayes' eyes found hers clearer now that oxygen was reaching his brain again. "Thank you," he whispered. Then, softer. "Ghost protocol. You're one of us." Sophie's entire body went rigid. Ghost protocol. Those words weren't supposed to exist in civilian space. They belonged to a world she'd left behind. A world of classified missions and names that didn't appear on any official roster. "Just rest," she said quickly, loud enough to cover his words. "You're going to be fine." Dr. Andrew Carlson, the trauma surgeon, burst through the ER doors at that moment, still pulling on a clean pair of scrubs. He was a no-nonsense man in his mid-40s who'd done 2 tours with the Army before going to medical school. He took one look at the scene. Hayes stabilized on the gurney with a chest seal and decompression needle in place, and immediately began barking orders. "Someone tell me what happened here," Carlson demanded, already examining Hayes' wounds with expert hands. "Training accident at Fort Bragg," one of Hayes' friends supplied. "Live fire exercise. Fragment from a breaching charge caught him in the chest." Carlson nodded, his face grim. "Get him to OR2 immediately. I want a full trauma panel and cross-match for 6 units. Move!" Quinn and 2 orderlies rushed the gurney toward the surgical wing. Hayes' friends jogged alongside, one of them pausing to look back at Sophie with an expression of profound gratitude. The ER fell silent except for the ambient beeping of monitors and the distant wail of sirens. Sophie stood in the middle of the department, her scrubs splattered with Hayes' blood, her hands still gloved and steady. Around her, the staff stared with expressions ranging from shock to awe to horror. Dr. Bradford's face had gone from red to white, his anger crystallizing into something colder and more dangerous. "You just ended your career, Nurse Randall." Malcolm Forrester arrived 15 minutes later, summoned from a budget meeting on the 3rd floor. The hospital administrator was a thin, meticulous man in his mid-50s who wore expensive suits and treated Pinehurst Medical Center like a business first and a place of healing second. He listened to Bradford's version of events with an expression of growing concern, occasionally glancing at Sophie, who stood silently with her arms at her sides. "Let me make sure I understand," Forrester said slowly. "Dr. Bradford made a medical decision to transfer an uninsured patient to a more appropriate facility. And you, Nurse Randall, overruled that decision and performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight? The patient was dying, Sophie said quietly. Another 10 minutes and he would have gone into full cardiac arrest. That assessment is not yours to make, Forrester replied. You're a registered nurse, not a physician. The hierarchy exists for legal and medical reasons. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Madison Foster, the young resident who'd been stitching up Tyler's skateboarding injuries, stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. Forrester, if I may, Nurse Randall was absolutely correct in her assessment. I reviewed Captain Hayes' chest x-rays. He had a severe tension pneumothorax. Without immediate decompression, he would have died before reaching County General. That's not the point, Dr. Foster, Bradford interjected sharply. The point is that a nurse with no authority performed a procedure that exposed this hospital to massive liability. What if she'd been wrong? What if she'd punctured his heart or caused additional damage? But she didn't, Foster protested. She saved his life. Through insubordination and reckless action, Forrester said firmly. He turned to Sophie, his expression regretful but unyielding. Nurse Randall, I appreciate that you believed you were acting in the patient's best interest, but Dr. Bradford is correct. You violated the chain of command and hospital protocol. In an environment like this, we cannot have nursing staff making independent medical decisions that contradict physician orders. Sophie felt a strange sense of detachment settling over her, the same feeling she'd had when she'd left the Navy, the inevitability of it. I understand. Given the severity of this incident, Forrester continued, I have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. You'll need to turn in your badge and any hospital property by the end of the day. Bethany Price gasped audibly. Even Evelyn Sawyer, who'd spent years maintaining professional distance from her younger colleagues, looked stricken. You're firing her? Quinn Sullivan said incredulously. She saved a man's life. She violated direct orders from the Chief of Emergency Medicine, Forrester replied. If we allow that behavior to go unpunished, we undermine the entire structure of medical authority in this institution. I'm sorry, but this decision is final. Sophie unbuttoned her blood-stained scrub top, revealing a clean white undershirt beneath. She removed her hospital ID badge and set it on the nurse's station counter with a soft click. Around her, the ER had gone completely silent. Even the usual background noise of monitors and overhead pages seemed to have faded. For what it's worth, Dr. Carlson said, appearing in the doorway to the surgical wing, that was some of the finest emergency medicine I've witnessed in 20 years of practice. Whoever trained you knew what they were doing. Sophie met his eyes and saw the question there, the same question that had been in Captain Hayes' eyes when he'd whispered, "Ghost protocol," but she just nodded politely. "Thank you, doctor." She walked to the staff locker room, aware of everyone's eyes following her. Inside, the room was empty and quiet. Her locker was in the back corner, adorned with nothing except a small calendar and a faded photograph of a beach at sunset. She changed into her civilian clothes, jeans and a plain gray sweater, and packed her few personal belongings into a canvas bag. At the bottom of her locker, hidden beneath a stack of old medical journals, was a small box. Sophie hesitated, then opened it. Inside lay a challenge coin, worn smooth from handling. The front bore an eagle and anchor with 13 stars. The back was engraved with words she'd tried hard to forget. "In the shadows we serve." She closed the box and put it in her bag. Then she shut her locker for the last time. When she emerged, Bethany was waiting in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. "Sophie, this isn't fair. Everyone knows you did the right thing." "Sometimes the right thing has consequences," Sophie replied gently. She gave Bethany a brief hug. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Quinn was waiting near the exit, his jaw set angrily. "This is such bullshit. Bradford's been looking for a reason to get rid of you for months." "Why would he want to get rid of me?" Sophie asked, genuinely curious. "I never caused problems." "That's exactly why," Quinn said. "You made everyone else look bad by comparison. You never complained, never cut corners, never tried to climb the ladder. It made his empire building look petty." Sophie hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe Quinn was right. Bradford had spent his entire career positioning himself for advancement, publishing papers, cultivating relationships with board members, building a reputation. To him, someone who just quietly did good work without seeking recognition must have seemed either naive or threatening. She walked out through the staff entrance, the same door she'd entered 3 years ago when she'd started at Pinehurst. The late afternoon sun was warm on her face, and the parking lot stretched before her, mostly empty at this hour. Her car, an aging Honda Civic with a dented bumper, sat in the far corner where she always parked to leave the closer spots for patients and visitors. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see the ER continuing its usual rhythm. People getting sick, people getting better, people making life-or-death decisions within the constraints of insurance policies and budget meetings. She'd thought she could be part of that world, that she could use her skills in a place where the stakes were lower and the nightmares less frequent. But some decisions don't fit neatly into protocol manuals. Some situations demand action that looks like insubordination on paper, but feels like the only possible choice in the moment. Sophie unlocked her car and sat in the driver's seat, not starting the engine yet. In her bag, the challenge coin felt heavy. She pulled it out and turned it over in her fingers, watching the afternoon light catch the worn engravings. How many times had she held this coin in field hospitals, in transport helicopters, in the brief quiet moments between crises? Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Foster. Hayes is out of surgery. Stable. Dr. Carlson says you saved his life. We all know you did the right thing. Sophie typed back a simple thank you and put her phone away. Then she started her car and drove home, leaving Pinehurst Medical Center behind, unaware that in 48 hours, her carefully constructed civilian life would be shattered by the roar of helicopter rotors and the resurrection of a name she'd tried so hard to bury. In the OR recovery room, Captain Logan Hayes drifted in and out of consciousness, his chest wrapped in surgical dressings and his vitals stable on the monitors. When Lieutenant Colonel David Ashford from Fort Bragg arrived to check on him, having been notified of the training accident, Hayes's first words were slurred but urgent. "The nurse," he mumbled through the anesthesia haze, "the one who saved me, she knew ghost protocol. She's one of the operators." Ashford leaned closer, his interest sharpening. "What nurse? What are you talking about, Captain?" "Brown hair, ponytail, Randall. Her name was Randall." Hayes's eyes struggled to focus. "She did a field decompression like she'd done it 100 times under fire. When I said ghost protocol, she knew exactly what I meant. You need to tell command." "Captain Hayes, you've been through significant trauma," Ashford said carefully. "You're on some heavy pain medication." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Hayes insisted, his words becoming clearer as adrenaline cut through the drugs. "She's Navy, has to be. The way she moved, the way she assessed. Sir, I've worked with corpsmen my entire career. She's not just trained, she's combat experienced. Top tier." Ashford pulled out his phone and made a note. "What happened to this nurse?" "They fired her," Hayes said, and even through the medication his anger was evident. "She saved my life, and they fired her for it." Ashford stood quietly for a moment, processing. Then he made a decision that would change everything. "I'll make some calls, Captain. Get some rest." As he left the hospital, Ashford was already dialing a number he rarely used, a direct line to Naval Special Warfare Command's Personnel Division. If Hayes was right, if there really was a ghost operator working as a civilian nurse, Command would want to know. Especially if she'd been fired for doing exactly what her training had taught her to do. The call connected, and Ashford explained the situation in careful detail. On the other end of the line, someone began pulling up classified service records, looking for a name: Sophie Randall. What they would find in those records, buried under layers of security clearance and redacted mission reports, would set in motion a chain of events that would bring military justice crashing into the quiet hallways of Pinehurst Medical Center. But for now, Sophie drove home in blessed ignorance, thinking only about updating her resume and figuring out how to pay next month's rent without a paycheck. She had no idea that halfway across the state, a Navy commander named Ruth Garrison was reading her service record with growing outrage and immediately ordering a helicopter deployment. The ghosts were coming home, whether Sophie was ready for them or not. Sophie's apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a converted textile mill in downtown Pinehurst. The building had been refurbished 15 years ago, and the exposed brick walls and high ceilings gave the space a shabby chic appeal that realtors loved to photograph. Sophie had chosen it for different reasons: the thick walls that muffled noise, the single entrance she could monitor, and the fact that the bedroom window faced the fire escape. Old habits died hard. She dropped her canvas bag on the small kitchen table and stood in the quiet apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic 3 stories below. The silence felt different than usual. Heavier, more permanent. For 3 years, her days had been structured around shift schedules and patient needs. Now, there was just empty time stretching ahead. Sophie poured herself a glass of water and sat on the worn couch, staring at nothing in particular. The apartment was clean but sparse, functional furniture, no artwork on the walls, no knickknacks or personal touches that might suggest permanence. The only photograph in the entire space sat on the bookshelf, that beach sunset she'd kept in her locker. It had been taken in San Diego, the day before her first deployment. She was 23 in that picture, freshly graduated from Navy Hospital Corpsman School, convinced she was going to save lives and make a difference. The woman in that photograph had no idea what was coming. Her phone rang, startling her from the memories. The screen showed Bethany's name. "Hey," Sophie answered. "Are you okay?" Bethany's voice was thick with concern. "Everyone here is so angry about what happened." Dr. Foster actually yelled at Dr. Bradford in the middle of the ER. I've never seen her lose her temper like that. Sophie felt a flicker of warmth despite everything. "I appreciate that, but it won't change anything. Forrester made his decision." "It's so unfair," Bethany insisted. "You saved that soldier's life. Hayes, Captain Hayes. He's doing really well, by the way. Dr. Carlson says he'll make a full recovery. That's because of you." "That's good," Sophie said quietly. "That's what matters." "What are you going to do now?" Sophie looked around her sparse apartment, at the life she'd built from nothing. "I'll figure something out. I always do." After Bethany hung up, Sophie sat in the gathering darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. Her mind kept drifting back to the moment Hayes had whispered, "Ghost Protocol," to the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He'd served with Navy corpsmen before. He'd known what he was seeing. The challenge coin sat on the coffee table where she'd left it. Sophie picked it up, running her thumb over the raised eagle and anchor. 13 stars for the original colonies. The motto on the back, "In the shadows we serve." The coin had been given to her by Master Chief Harold Benson after the Kandahar operation, though officially, the Kandahar operation had never happened. Officially, Sophie Randall had been a corpsman attached to a standard Marine platoon, providing routine medical support in relatively safe territory. Unofficially, she'd spent 18 months embedded with a Joint Special Operations Task Force, providing trauma care in situations that never made it into any after-action reports. The memories came whether she wanted them or not. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, 4 years ago. The compound was supposed to be clear. Intelligence had reported it abandoned, just another empty mud brick structure in a landscape of empty mud brick structures. The assault team, 8 Marines and 2 Navy corpsmen, had entered cautiously anyway, because intelligence was wrong about half the time and dead was forever. Sophie had been 29 then, on her second deployment with MARSOC units, her medical pack loaded with enough supplies to keep a small hospital running. She'd treated everything from gunshot wounds to dehydration to a Marine who'd somehow managed to break his thumb during a vehicle insertion. The guys called her Doc, which all corpsmen were called, and they trusted her to keep them alive, which was the only reputation that mattered. The explosion came from nowhere and everywhere at once. An IED wired to a pressure plate in the compound's interior room, crude but devastatingly effective. The blast wave threw Sophie backward through a doorway, her ears ringing, her vision white with dust and shock. When her senses returned, she was lying on her back staring up at a ceiling crisscrossed with exposed beams. Someone was screaming. Several someones. Training took over. Sophie rolled to her hands and knees, doing a rapid self-assessment. No major bleeding, nothing broken, lungs working. She grabbed her medical pack and crawled toward the screaming. The interior room was a nightmare. 3 Marines down, all with significant blast injuries. Lance Corporal Mendez had a piece of shrapnel embedded in his thigh, arterial bleeding pumping with each heartbeat. Sergeant Willis had compound fractures in both legs and was going into shock. Corporal Jackson was unconscious with a probable skull fracture and blood leaking from his ear. The other corpsman, a soft-spoken kid from Minnesota named Tyler, was dead, killed instantly by a piece of the wall that had turned into a projectile. Sophie was alone with 3 dying men and maybe 8 minutes before enemy fighters arrived to investigate the explosion. "Doc!" Mendez gasped, his face sheet white. "Doc, I can't feel my leg." "You're gonna be fine," Sophie said automatically, her hands already applying a tourniquet high on his thigh. She had to stop the arterial bleeding first, or he'd be dead in 3 minutes. "Stay with me, Mendez. Tell me about your girlfriend, the one from the pictures." "Marina," Mendez whispered. She's pregnant, due in December." "Then you're going to meet your kid," Sophie said firmly, cinching the tourniquet tight. Mendez screamed, but the bleeding slowed to a manageable ooze. "Jackson, talk to me!" The unconscious Marine didn't respond. Sophie did a rapid neurocheck. Pupils unequal, one blown, severe head trauma, possible brain bleed. Nothing she could do for that in the field, except keep him breathing and evacuate fast. Willis was going into hypovolemic shock, his blood pressure dropping as his body tried to compensate for the trauma. Sophie started an IV line with hands that didn't shake despite the chaos, pushing fluids and calling for the rest of the team on her radio. "Alpha 6, this is Doc Randall. We have 3 urgent casualties, 1 routine, I repeat, 3 urgent surgical. Request immediate case vac." The team leader's voice crackled back through heavy static. "Doc, we're pinned down outside. Enemy fighters coming from the north. You're going to have to hold position for at least 20 mics." 20 minutes. Sophie looked at her casualties. Willis might last that long if she could stabilize him. Mendez would probably make it with the tourniquet in place. Jackson needed a neurosurgeon within the next hour, or he'd die from increased intracranial pressure. She had morphine, IV fluids, bandages, and a sidearm with 2 magazines. Against unknown numbers of enemy fighters, in a compound with 1 exit, with 3 men who couldn't move. The math was impossible. Sophie did it anyway. She dragged all 3 casualties into the most defensible corner of the room, using fallen debris to create a makeshift barrier. She kept one hand on Willis's IV line and the other on her M9 pistol. Through gaps in the shattered wall, she could see movement, figures in dark clothing moving through the compound's outer courtyard. "Hey, Doc," Mendez whispered, his voice weak. "If this goes bad, tell Marina I loved her. Tell my kid I wanted to meet him." "You're going to tell them yourself," Sophie said. "Now shut up and conserve your strength." The first enemy fighter appeared in the doorway, his AK-47 raised. Sophie shot him twice in the chest before he could fire, the reports deafening in the enclosed space. 2 more fighters rushed the door and she dropped them both, her hands steady, her breathing controlled. She'd been trained for this. Not just as a corpsman, but in the additional schools the Navy had sent her to, schools that didn't appear on her official record. Combat medicine under fire. Close quarters combat. Survival and evasion. For 17 minutes, Sophie Randall held that position. She rotated between treating her casualties and engaging enemy fighters who tried to breach the room. She burned through both magazines and scavenged ammunition from the fallen Marines' gear. She kept Willis's blood pressure stable, monitored Jackson's deteriorating pupils, and talked to Mendez about his unborn child. When the QRF finally arrived, 6 heavily armed Marines who cleared the compound room by room, they found Sophie sitting against the wall, her uniform soaked in blood, her pistol empty, and her 3 casualties alive. Master Chief Benson had been with the QRF. He'd taken one look at the scene. The bodies in the doorway, the improvised defensive position, the still functioning IV lines, and said quietly, "Jesus Christ, Doc. What the hell happened here?" "I kept them alive," Sophie had replied simply. All 3 Marines survived. Mendez went home to meet his daughter. Willis learned to walk again after 6 surgeries. Jackson had permanent neurological damage, but was alive to make his own decisions about his future. Sophie received the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V, though the citation was deliberately vague about the details. She also received a reputation among special operations units. When you needed a corpsman who could function in the absolute worst conditions, you requested Doc Randall. She'd done 2 more deployments after Kandahar, each one pulling her deeper into the classified world of Joint Special Operations. She'd treated gunshot wounds on moving helicopters, performed field surgery by flashlight, and once kept a SEAL alive for 4 hours during an extraction that went catastrophically wrong. The nightmare started during the 3rd deployment, the inability to sleep anywhere that didn't have a clear exit. The hypervigilance that made normal civilian interactions exhausting. The way her heart rate spiked whenever she heard sudden loud noises. After her 4th deployment, Sophie's commanding officer, Commander Ruth Garrison, had sat her down for what the Navy called a career discussion and what Sophie recognized as an intervention. "You're one of the best combat corpsmen I've ever worked with," Garrison had said bluntly. "You're also burning out. I can see it. Your team leaders can see it. The question is whether you can see it." Sophie had wanted to argue, but she couldn't. She'd been waking up in cold sweats 3 times a night. She'd lost 15 pounds because food didn't taste like anything anymore. She'd started having intrusive thoughts about all the ways the people around her could suddenly die. "What are my options?" she'd asked. "You can rotate to a hospital stateside. Walter Reed would take you in a heartbeat. Or you can separate and figure out what civilian life looks like." Sophie had chosen separation. Not because she didn't love the work. She did with an intensity that scared her, but because she recognized that she was becoming someone she didn't want to be, someone who only felt alive when people were dying around her. The transition had been brutal. Civilian nursing felt simultaneously too slow and too fast, too mundane and too overwhelming. But Sophie had persisted, building a quiet life in Pinehurst, helping people without the weight of classified missions and combat stress. Until today, when all of it had come crashing back the moment she'd seen Captain Logan Hayes bleeding out in the ER lobby. Sophie blinked, realizing she'd been sitting in the dark for over an hour, lost in memories. The challenge coin was warm in her palm from being clutched so tightly. She set it down gently and stood, her knees protesting the stillness. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number with a North Carolina area code. "Hello? Is this Sophie Randall?" A woman's voice, professional and guarded. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Jessica Hayes. I'm Captain Logan Hayes' sister. I wanted to thank you for saving my brother's life." Sophie felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "How is he doing?" "He's stable. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery." Jessica's voice wavered. "They also said that if you hadn't acted when you did, he would have died before reaching County General. And then I heard that the hospital fired you for helping him." "Hospital policy," Sophie said quietly. "I don't blame them for following their rules." "I blame them," Jessica said fiercely. "Logan is my only brother. He's the best person I know. And he nearly died because of an insurance verification policy. That's insane." Sophie didn't disagree, but she also understood the impossible position administrators like Forrester were in. Hospitals operated on razor-thin margins. One uninsured patient could mean layoffs for support staff or reduced services for everyone else. It was a broken system, but the people enforcing it weren't necessarily villains. "I'm just glad your brother is going to be okay," Sophie said. "Logan wants to talk to you," Jessica continued. "He's been asking about you since he woke up from surgery. He says you knew things that you shouldn't know. Military things." Sophie's hand tightened on the phone. "Your brother was under significant stress and pain medication. Memory can be unreliable in those situations." "That's what I thought too," Jessica admitted. "But Logan is very insistent. He says he needs to talk to someone at Fort Bragg about you. Something about verifying your background." A cold feeling spread through Sophie's stomach. "Ms. Hayes, I appreciate your brother's gratitude, but I'm just a nurse who did what any medical professional would do. There's nothing to verify." "Okay," Jessica said, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it. "I just wanted to say thank you. If there's anything we can do—" "There isn't," Sophie interrupted gently. "But I appreciate the call. Take care of your brother." She ended the call and sat back down, her mind racing. Hayes was asking questions, talking to people at Fort Bragg. That was dangerous, not because Sophie had done anything wrong, but because her service record was mostly classified. If Hayes started pulling threads, people would notice. People like Commander Ruth Garrison, who had been furious when Sophie separated from the Navy. Garrison had made it clear that she considered Sophie's decision to leave as abandoning a higher calling. "You're wasting yourself," Garrison had said during their final meeting. "You could train the next generation, lead programs, make a real difference. Instead, you're going to go change bedpans in some civilian hospital?" Sophie had absorbed the criticism without response, knowing that Garrison couldn't understand. For Garrison, the military was home, purpose, and identity all wrapped together. For Sophie, it had become a weight she could no longer carry. Now that weight was coming back whether she wanted it or not. At Pinehurst Medical Center, Captain Logan Hayes was sitting up in bed, his chest wrapped in bandages but his mind clear for the first time since the accident. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford had returned with his preliminary findings, and Hayes was listening with growing satisfaction. "Your nurse checked out exactly as you said," Ashford reported, keeping his voice low despite the private room. "Sophie Randall, 34 years old, separated from the Navy 3 years ago with an honorable discharge. Her service record is heavily redacted, but what I could access shows 4 deployments attached to Marine and Special Operations units. Multiple commendations including a Combat Action Ribbon and a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with V device." Hayes nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "So she's legit, one of ours." "More than that," Ashford said. "I made some calls to contacts at WARCOM. Her call sign was Angel 6. She's something of a legend among the guys who worked with her. Apparently she held off an enemy assault single-handedly while treating 3 urgent casualties. Saved all 3. And Pinehurst fired her for saving my life," Hayes said, anger tightening his voice. "Sir, that's not right. She violated their policies because she knew I'd die otherwise. She sacrificed her job for someone she'd never met." Ashford was quiet for a moment. "What do you want me to do, Captain?" "I want command to know what happened here. I want them to know that one of their decorated corpsmen got fired for doing exactly what we trained her to do." Hayes met Ashford's eyes. "And I want someone to stand up for her the way she stood up for me." Ashford nodded slowly. "I'll make the calls. But Hayes, if she separated voluntarily, she might not want the Navy involved in her civilian life. Some people leave for good reasons." "I understand that, sir," Hayes replied. "But she deserves to know that we've got her back, that the people she served with haven't forgotten what she sacrificed." After Ashford left, Hayes lay back against his pillows, exhausted but satisfied. Through his partially open door, he could hear the sounds of the hospital, monitors beeping, nurses chatting at their station, the distant ding of an elevator. It was all so normal, so routine. 36 hours ago, he'd been bleeding out in this same building, staring up at fluorescent lights and wondering if he'd ever see his sister again. Then a nurse with steady hands and impossibly calm eyes had saved his life with the kind of battlefield medicine that shouldn't exist in civilian space. Hayes had worked with Navy corpsmen throughout his career. He knew what good looked like. Sophie Randall wasn't just good, she was exceptional. The kind of corpsman that junior guys hoped would be attached to their unit. The kind that senior leaders fought to recruit for high-risk operations. And she'd been working in a civilian ER, taking orders from doctors who didn't understand what she was capable of, accepting disrespect and low pay without complaint. That was going to change. Hayes would make sure of it. At Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters in San Diego, Commander Ruth Garrison was having a very bad day. It had started with a budget meeting, continued through a frustrating conference call about equipment procurement, and was now being capped off by an email that made her want to throw her computer through the window. The email was from Lieutenant Colonel Ashford at Fort Bragg, forwarded through official channels with a priority flag. It contained a detailed account of an incident at Pinehurst Medical Center involving a former Navy corpsman named Sophie Randall. Garrison read the email 3 times, her jaw tightening with each pass. Sophie had been working as a civilian nurse. Sophie had saved an Army Ranger's life using advanced combat medical techniques. Sophie had been fired for insubordination. Garrison stood and paced her office, anger and frustration warring for dominance. When Sophie had separated 3 years ago, Garrison had tried everything short of a direct order to change her mind. Sophie was the best combat corpsman Garrison had ever commanded. Cool under fire, technically brilliant, completely fearless when lives were at stake. Losing her had been a blow to the entire program. And now she was out in the civilian world, still doing what she'd been trained to do, but without any of the support or recognition she deserved. Garrison picked up her phone and dialed Master Chief Benson's extension. "Chief, I need you in my office, now." Benson arrived 3 minutes later, his weathered face creased with concern. "What's wrong, Commander?" Garrison handed him the printed email. "Read this." Benson read silently, his expression darkening. When he finished, he looked up at Garrison with something close to fury in his eyes. "They fired Doc Randall? For saving a ranger's life?" According to this, she violated hospital protocol by overruling a physician's decision. Garrison's voice dripped with contempt. The physician wanted to transfer the patient to another facility for insurance reasons. Sophie recognized that the patient would die during transfer and acted accordingly. "That's exactly what we trained her to do," Benson said. "Make the call, save the life, deal with consequences later." "I know." Garrison sat back down, her mind already working through options. "The question is what we do about it." Benson was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Commander, Doc Randall chose to leave. She made it clear she was done with the military. If we go charging in there, we might be making things worse for her. Or we might be reminding her that she's not alone," Garrison countered. "That the people she served with don't abandon their own when they're being persecuted for doing the right thing." "What did you have in mind?" Garrison pulled up a form on her computer, a request for helicopter transport for official personnel movement. "I think it's time for a site visit to Pinehurst Medical Center. Purely for official purposes, of course. We need to commend Captain Hayes for his service and ensure our military personnel are being treated appropriately at civilian facilities." Benson's weathered face split into a grin. "And if we happen to have a conversation with hospital administration about the former Navy corpsman they fired, well, that's just good inter-service relations." "Exactly," Garrison began typing rapidly. "Get me Lieutenant Cooper Stone and his team. I want 2 helicopters ready to deploy within 24 hours. Full dress uniforms. By the book. We're going to show Pinehurst Medical Center what the United States Navy thinks of people who punish our personnel for doing their jobs." "With respect, Commander," Benson said quietly, "Doc Randall isn't our personnel anymore, she's a civilian." "Once a corpsman, always a corpsman," Garrison replied firmly. "Sophie might have left the Navy, but she's still one of ours, and we take care of our own." As Benson left to make arrangements, Garrison pulled up Sophie's service record on her secure terminal. The file was heavily redacted, full of black bars and classified annexes, but the parts she could read told a story of extraordinary competence and dedication. 4 deployments, 17 major combat actions, 38 Purple Hearts prevented through immediate trauma care, 0 casualties among patients who reached her alive. Sophie Randall was a hero by any reasonable definition, and now she'd been fired for acting like one. That was going to change. One way or another, Garrison would make sure of it. Sophie spent the next day in a haze of mundane tasks that felt surreal in their normalcy. She updated her resume, highlighting her civilian nursing experience while carefully omitting the military service that would raise questions she didn't want to answer. She called 2 nursing agencies about temporary placement. She paid her bills online and calculated how long her savings would last. 6 months, maybe 7 if she was careful. Enough time to find another position, assuming her termination from Pinehurst didn't make her unhireable. In the afternoon, she walked to the library to return her overdue books, a mystery novel, and a gardening guide she'd never gotten around to reading. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Peterson, smiled sympathetically. "I heard about what happened at the hospital," Mrs. Peterson said quietly. "My daughter works in radiology. She said you saved a soldier's life and they fired you for it." Word traveled fast in a town the size of Pinehurst. Sophie managed a small smile. "Hospital policy. They had their reasons." "Well, I think it's shameful," Mrs. Peterson declared. "You did the right thing. Anyone with sense can see that." Sophie appreciated the support, but didn't know how to respond. She collected her returned books, thanked Mrs. Peterson, and walked home through the late afternoon heat. Her apartment was stuffy, the air conditioning struggling against the summer sun. Sophie changed into shorts and a tank top, pulled her hair into a messy bun, and tried to decide what to do with the rest of her evening. She could watch television, but nothing held her interest. She could read, but her concentration was shot. She could go for a run, but the thought of being outside among people felt exhausting. Instead, she found herself pulling out a box from the back of her closet, a box she hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside were the pieces of her military life that she'd kept, despite knowing she should throw them away. Her corpsman warfare pin, a flag that had flown over her forward operating base. Letters from Marines and SEALs she'd treated, thanking her for keeping them alive. Photographs of people she'd served with, half of whom were dead now. At the bottom of the box was her DD-214, her discharge paperwork. Sophie pulled it out and read through the dry bureaucratic language that summarized 11 years of her life in a few short paragraphs. Honorable discharge. Multiple commendations. No mention of the nightmares or the weight loss or the slow realization that she was losing herself one mission at a time. Her phone rang, another unknown number. Hello? Petty Officer Randall? A man's voice, formal and respectful. Sophie's heart skipped. No one had called her by rank in 3 years. This is Sophie Randall. Who's calling? Master Chief Harold Benson, Naval Special Warfare Command. I apologize for calling you directly, but I wanted to reach out personally about a situation that's come to our attention. Sophie sat down slowly, the DD-214 still in her hand. Master Chief, it's been a long time. Too long, Doc. Benson's voice warmed slightly. I heard about what happened at Pinehurst. That you saved Captain Hayes's life and got fired for it. I wanted you to know that the Navy hasn't forgotten what you did for us. What you sacrificed. I appreciate that, Master Chief, but I'm not in the Navy anymore. What happens to me in civilian life isn't really your concern. With respect, Doc, that's where you're wrong. Benson's tone became more formal. You were one of the finest combat corpsmen I ever had the privilege of working with. You saved lives under conditions that would break most people. And now you're being punished for doing exactly what we trained you to do. That is absolutely our concern. Sophie felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them away angrily. Master Chief, I chose to leave. I made that decision knowing I was walking away from everything I'd built. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, Benson conceded, but we're gonna make things right anyway. Commander Garrison is deploying to Pinehurst tomorrow. She wants to have a conversation with the hospital administration about how they treat military personnel and the people who save their lives. Horror swept through Sophie. Master Chief, no, please don't do this. I just want to move on quietly. I don't want attention or confrontation or… Doc, listen to me, Benson interrupted gently. You spent 11 years putting yourself between bad guys and good guys, between death and life. You earn the right to move on quietly if that's what you want. But that doesn't mean we're going to let people disrespect what you did. Commander Garrison isn't coming to force you back into service. She's coming to make sure everyone understands that what you did was heroic, not criminal. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. When? 48 hours after your termination, tomorrow afternoon. You don't have to be there if you don't want to be. But I thought you should know. After the call ended, Sophie sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, holding her DD-214 in one hand and her challenge coin in the other. The two halves of her life, military and civilian, had stayed carefully separate for 3 years. Now they were colliding, and she had no idea what the fallout would look like. Tomorrow afternoon, 48 hours after she'd walked out of Pinehurst Medical Center for what she'd thought was the last time. The ghosts were coming home, and Sophie Randall was no longer sure whether she was ready to face them. The morning of the second day after her termination, Sophie woke at dawn out of habit. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city waking up around her. Somewhere below, a car door slammed. A dog barked. Normal sounds of a normal day. Except today wasn't normal. Today the Navy was coming. Sophie got up and made coffee, then stood at her kitchen window watching the sun rise over Pinehurst's downtown skyline. The renovated textile mills and newer office buildings caught the early light, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. In a few hours, those streets would fill with morning commuters heading to jobs they hadn't been fired from, living lives that made sense. Her phone sat on the counter, silent. She'd turned off notifications last night, unable to handle any more well-meaning calls from former colleagues or curious messages from acquaintances who'd heard about the incident. The only person she wanted to talk to was the one person she couldn't call, her younger sister Emily, who lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids and thought Sophie had spent her Navy years doing routine medical work on hospital ships. Some lies were kinder than the truth. At 11 o'clock, Sophie showered and dressed in jeans and a simple blue blouse. She wasn't sure if she should go to the hospital or stay away. whether her presence would make things better or worse. Master Chief Benson had said she didn't have to be there, but the thought of Commander Garrison confronting hospital administration without her felt cowardly somehow. She was still debating when her phone rang. Quinn Sullivan's name appeared on the screen. "Quinn, hey!" "Sophie, you need to get down here." Quinn's voice was tight with barely suppressed excitement. "Now? You're not gonna believe what's happening." "What's going on?" "I can't explain over the phone. Just get here. Trust me." Sophie grabbed her keys and headed for the door, her heart already starting to race. The drive to Pinehurst Medical Center took 12 minutes through midday traffic. Sophie parked in the visitor lot this time, no longer entitled to use staff parking. As she walked toward the main entrance, she noticed people gathered at the windows of the upper floors, all looking in the same direction. Then she heard it. The sound was distant at first, a rhythmic thumping that could have been construction equipment or highway noise. But Sophie's body recognized it before her conscious mind did, every muscle tensing with familiar alertness. Helicopter rotors. Multiple aircraft, flying in formation. She stopped walking, her feet rooted to the asphalt. Around her, other people in the parking lot were looking up, shielding their eyes against the noon sun. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was impossible to mistake. Two Navy MH-60S Seahawk helicopters appeared over the tree line, flying low and fast in tight formation. They were the dark gray color of military aircraft, with Navy markings clearly visible on their fuselages. The lead helicopter had additional communications equipment mounted on its exterior, a command bird. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. This was real. This was actually happening. The helicopters circled the hospital once, a clear announcement of their presence, before descending toward the large grassy area adjacent to the parking lot. The downdraft from their rotors sent debris flying, whipping trees into frenzied motion. Car alarms began shrieking. People scattered, some running for cover, others pulling out phones to record the spectacle. Sophie stood frozen, watching her past literally dropping out of the sky. The helicopters touched down with military precision, their skids settling onto the grass simultaneously. The rotors began to slow but didn't stop completely. This wasn't a landing, it was a deliberate show of force. The side doors slid open, and personnel began emerging. First came Lieutenant Cooper Stone, a SEAL officer Sophie vaguely remembered from a joint training exercise years ago. He was in full dress uniform, his chest heavy with ribbons and decorations. Behind him came 6 more personnel, also in dress uniforms, moving with the disciplined coordination of a ceremonial unit. Then, Commander Ruth Garrison stepped out of the lead helicopter. Garrison looked exactly as Sophie remembered, tall and imposing in her service dress blues, her graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her posture radiating command authority. She surveyed the gathered crowd with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to controlling chaos, then locked eyes directly with Sophie across 50 yards of parking lot. Sophie felt the weight of that gaze like a physical force. For 3 years she'd managed to avoid this moment, this confrontation with the life she'd left behind. Now there was nowhere to hide. Garrison began walking toward the hospital entrance, her formation following in precise steps behind her. Hospital security was emerging from the building. Security Chief Lawrence Cooper, looking completely out of his depth, as he tried to figure out protocol for military personnel who'd just landed helicopters on hospital property. "Ma'am, I need to ask you too," Cooper began. "Security Chief Cooper?" Garrison's voice carried effortlessly across the distance. "I'm Commander Ruth Garrison, Naval Special Warfare Command. We're here on official business regarding one of our personnel. I'll need to speak with your hospital administrator immediately." Cooper blinked, clearly trying to process the phrase "our personnel" in relation to his quiet civilian hospital. "Ma'am, we're a civilian facility. We don't have any military personnel employed here." "You did until 2 days ago," Garrison interrupted. "Where is Malcolm Forrester?" Inside the hospital, absolute chaos reigned. The ER waiting room had emptied as patients and visitors rushed to the windows to watch the helicopter landing. Nurses and doctors crowded the glass, phones out, taking pictures and videos that would be all over social media within minutes. Dr. Madison Foster stood at the window with her mouth open. "Is this real? Are we being invaded?" "That's Navy," Dr. Andrew Carlson said slowly, his military experience allowing him to identify the service branch. "That's a command deployment. Brass." Bethany Price grabbed Quinn Sullivan's arm. "Did you know this was going to happen?" "I knew something was coming," Quinn admitted. "Captain Hayes has been making calls. Apparently he has friends in high places who are very unhappy about what happened to Sophie." Evelyn Sawyer pushed her way to the window, her usual stern expression replaced by pure shock. "They deployed helicopters? For a terminated nurse?" "Not just a nurse," Quinn said quietly. "Sophie was something else before she came here, something important." On the third floor, Malcolm Forrester was in a budget meeting when his assistant burst through the door without knocking, her face pale. "Mr. Forrester, there are military helicopters on the lawn. Navy personnel are demanding to see you immediately." Forrester set down his pen carefully. "I'm sorry, what?" "Military helicopters," the assistant repeated. "They just landed outside. The commander is asking for you by name." Dr. Winston Bradford, who'd been presenting revised staffing projections, went rigid. "This is about Randall. It has to be." Forrester stood, his mind racing through implications and liability concerns. Military intervention in a civilian personnel matter was unprecedented in his experience. Get legal on the phone and find out what these people want before this turns into a public relations disaster. By the time Forrester and Bradford reached the main lobby, Commander Garrison and her formation had already entered the building. They stood in perfect formation near the reception desk, drawing every eye in the crowded space. Several patients in wheelchairs had stopped to stare. A young mother held her toddler closer, uncertain whether to be frightened or awed. Garrison waited with perfect patience, her hands clasped behind her back, until Forrester approached. "I'm Malcolm Forrester, hospital administrator," he said, trying to project authority despite feeling completely wrong-footed. "Commander, I'm not sure what brings you here, but landing military aircraft on our property without authorization is—" "I'm here about Sophie Randall," Garrison said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby. The room went silent. "Specifically, I'm here to address the unconscionable decision to terminate her employment after she saved the life of an Army Ranger, using skills the United States Navy spent millions of dollars training her to use." Forrester felt heat rising to his face. Around them, phones were definitely recording now. "Commander, with all respect, personnel matters are internal hospital business. We don't discuss employee terminations with outside parties." "Sophie Randall is not an outside party to the United States Navy," Garrison replied. "She served with distinction for 11 years as a combat corpsman attached to Marine and Special Operations units. She holds multiple commendations for valor under fire. She is a decorated veteran who was fired for doing exactly what her training demanded, saving a life when protocol would have let that life end." Bradford stepped forward, his professional armor firmly in place. "Commander, I'm Dr. Winston Bradford, Chief of Emergency Medicine. I understand you're concerned about one of your former personnel, but the medical hierarchy exists for patient safety. Nurse Randall violated direct orders from a licensed physician. That cannot be overlooked regardless of her military background." "Her military background," Garrison said softly, dangerously, "includes holding off an enemy assault while treating 3 urgent casualties, any one of whom would have died without her intervention. It includes 4 combat deployments where she maintained a perfect survival rate for patients who reached her alive. It includes skills and experience that your entire emergency department combined couldn't match." Master Chief Benson stepped forward, his weathered face stern. "Captain Logan Hayes, the patient she saved, asked us to convey his gratitude. He also wanted hospital administration to understand that Petty Officer Randall used advanced combat medical techniques that are only taught to Special Operations corpsmen. Techniques that saved his life when your protocols would have killed him." Forrester glanced at Bradford, seeing his own uncertainty reflected there. This wasn't a simple personnel dispute anymore. This was military brass publicly challenging the hospital's authority, with cameras rolling and social media spreading the story in real time. "Where is Sophie Randall?" Garrison asked, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "Is she here?" Sophie had entered the lobby through a side door, staying near the walls, trying to remain invisible, but Garrison's trained eye found her immediately. "Petty Officer Randall," Garrison said formally, "front and center." The crowd parted as Sophie walked forward, her civilian clothes and loose ponytail contrasting sharply with the military formation's pressed uniforms. She moved with reluctance, each step feeling like a betrayal of the quiet life she'd tried to build. When she reached Garrison, she stopped, unsure of protocol. She was a civilian now. She didn't have to salute or follow orders. But 11 years of training were hard to override. "Commander," she said quietly. Garrison's stern expression softened slightly. "It's good to see you, Doc. I wish it were under better circumstances. I wish you hadn't come." "I know." Garrison's voice dropped so only Sophie could hear. "But we're not going to let them punish you for being who you are. Not without a fight." She turned back to Forrester and Bradford, her voice rising to command volume again. "Gentlemen, I'd like to formally introduce Petty Officer First Class Sophie Randall, United States Navy, retired. During her service, she earned the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device for actions in Kandahar, where she single-handedly defended 3 casualties while under direct enemy fire. She also earned the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal twice, the Combat Action Ribbon, and the Afghanistan Campaign Medal with 3 campaign stars. The lobby was utterly silent except for the beeping of medical equipment somewhere in the distance. Sophie stood rigid, mortified by the public revelation of details she'd spent 3 years hiding. Lieutenant Stone stepped forward, carrying a wooden presentation case. He opened it to reveal a folded American flag and several medals mounted on velvet. These decorations were presented to Petty Officer Randall during her service. "We're here today to ensure that civilian leadership understands the caliber of the professional they terminated." Dr. Madison Foster pushed through the crowd, her young face flushed with emotion. "Mr. Forrester, I tried to tell you, Sophie saved Captain Hayes's life. She performed a needle decompression with perfect technique under enormous pressure. That's not insubordination, that's expertise." "Dr. Foster, return to your duties," Bradford ordered. "No," Foster said, her voice shaking but firm. "I won't. This is wrong." "Everyone in the ER knows it's wrong. We've all been too afraid to say it, but I'm done being afraid." Bethany Price stepped out of the crowd next, her blonde curls bouncing as she moved. "Sophie is the best nurse I've ever worked with. She stayed late to help with difficult patients. She took the worst shifts without complaining. She taught me more about emergency medicine than I learned in nursing school." Quinn Sullivan joined them. She saved a kid in the parking lot last year, used an expired EpiPen from her personal emergency kit to treat anaphylaxis. Never reported it, because she didn't want recognition. That's who she is. More voices joined the chorus. Nurses, technicians, even a few patients who'd been treated by Sophie. The groundswell of support built organically, each person adding their testimony to a growing monument of evidence that the hospital had made a catastrophic mistake. Forrester looked around the lobby, seeing his carefully managed institution crumbling into chaos. The optics were devastating. Military brass defending a fired nurse, while current staff publicly contradicted their administration. The videos being recorded would be shared thousands of times. The story would be picked up by local news, maybe national news. "Commander Garrison," he said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this in my office rather than in a public lobby." "I have no problem with the public nature of this conversation," Garrison replied. "Sophie Randall was publicly fired. She deserves public vindication." Sophie finally found her voice. "Commander, please, this isn't necessary." Garrison looked at her with an expression Sophie couldn't quite read. Anger mixed with concern, mixed with something else. Pride, maybe. "Doc, you spent 11 years making impossible choices in impossible situations. You saved lives that everyone else had written off. You earned the right to move on quietly if that's what you want. But that doesn't mean we're going to stand by while people who don't understand what you sacrificed treat you like you did something wrong." "I violated hospital protocol," Sophie said. "Dr. Bradford made a decision based on the information he had. I countermanded that decision. By civilian standards, I was insubordinate. By military standards, Master Chief Benson said you did your job. You assessed the tactical situation, recognized that following orders would result in a preventable casualty, and you adapted. That's what we trained you to do." Dr. Andrew Carlson stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Forrester, if I may, I'm the trauma surgeon who operated on Captain Hayes. I've reviewed the case extensively. Sophie's intervention was not just appropriate, it was exceptional. The needle decompression was placed with textbook precision. Her assessment of the tension pneumothorax was accurate. Her decision to act saved a life that would have been lost if we'd followed Dr. Bradford's transfer protocol. Bradford's face flushed dark red. Dr. Carlson, you're undermining departmental authority. I'm stating medical facts, Carlson interrupted. And I'm also stating that in 20 years of trauma surgery, including 2 combat tours, I've rarely seen better emergency medicine than what Sophie performed in our ER. Firing her was a mistake, a serious mistake. Forrester held up his hands, trying to regain control of the situation. Everyone, please, let's take a breath. Commander Garrison, I appreciate you bringing Ms. Randall's military service to our attention. However, the termination decision was based on protocol violations, not on questioning her competence. Hospitals must maintain strict chains of command to ensure patient safety. Patient safety, Garrison repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of that reasoning. Tell me, Mr. Forrester, how exactly would patient safety have been served by letting Captain Hayes die in transit to another facility? That's a false choice, Forrester insisted. The situation could have been managed within proper channels. There was no time, Sophie said quietly. All eyes turned to her. Hayes had 8 to 10 minutes before cardiovascular collapse. County General was 25 minutes away. The math doesn't work. You couldn't have known that with certainty, Bradford argued. Yes, I could. Sophie's voice was steady, factual. I've treated tension pneumothorax dozens of times under field conditions. I know exactly how the condition progresses and what the timeline looks like. Captain Hayes would have died in the ambulance, probably before they'd even left Pinehurst city limits. An older woman stepped forward from the crowd. Harriet Brennan, the longtime patient who'd been in the ER waiting room when Hayes was brought in. She leaned heavily on her cane, her voice quavering but clear. I saw what happened that day. I saw that young soldier bleeding, begging for help. I saw that doctor, she pointed at Bradford, turn him away because of paperwork. And I saw this young lady save his life while everyone else just stood there. You want to fire her for that? You should be ashamed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Forrester could see the situation spiraling beyond his control, each voice adding momentum to a narrative that made Pinehurst Medical Center look cruel and bureaucratic. His phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it and saw messages from board members, all asking variations of the same question. What the hell is happening at the hospital? Commander, I need to consult with our board of directors, Forrester said. This situation has become more complex than a simple personnel matter. If you'll give me 24 hours to review. No, Garrison said flatly. Sophie Randall doesn't need your review or your approval. She needs an apology and an acknowledgement that she was right and you were wrong. Bradford couldn't contain himself any longer. This is outrageous. You can't just storm into a civilian hospital and demand we reverse personnel decisions. We have legal protections, procedures. You have a PR disaster, Lieutenant Stone said calmly. Every major news outlet in North Carolina is going to run this story by evening. Hospital fires decorated combat medic for saving soldier's life. How do you think that headline will affect your donor relations, your community standing, your ability to recruit quality medical staff? Forrester felt sick. Stone was right. The damage was already done, spreading across social media in real time. The only question was whether Pinehurst could salvage anything from the wreckage. What do you want? He asked Garrison. I want Sophie Randall reinstated with full back pay and a formal apology from hospital administration, Garrison said. I want clear documentation that her actions were medically appropriate and ethically correct. And I want assurance that Pinehurst Medical Center will review its protocols to prevent future situations where bureaucracy overrides life-saving care. Forrester looked at Bradford, who was practically vibrating with suppressed rage. Then he looked at Sophie, who stood quietly amid the chaos, her expression unreadable. Ms. Randall, Forrester said carefully, would you accept reinstatement under those terms? Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Everyone in the lobby seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her response. I need to think about it, she finally said. The answer surprised everyone, including Garrison. Doc. Commander, may I speak with you privately? Sophie's voice was polite but firm. Please. Garrison hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Conference room? Security Chief Cooper hastily directed them to a small conference room off the main lobby. Sophie walked in first, followed by Garrison and Master Chief Benson. The door closed, muffling the noise from the crowded lobby. As soon as they were alone, Sophie turned to face Garrison. "Why did you do this? I told Master Chief I wanted to move on quietly." "Moving on quietly isn't the same as being erased," Garrison replied. "They fired you, Sophie. They punished you for being excellent at your job. I wasn't going to let that stand." "It wasn't your choice to make." Sophie's voice rose slightly. "I left the Navy, Commander. I left because I couldn't do it anymore. Because I was drowning in it. And now, you've brought it all back, made it public, put me on display like some kind of trophy." "That's not what this is," Garrison interrupted. "This is about respect, about making sure the sacrifice you made is recognized instead of punished." "I don't want recognition," Sophie's control finally cracked. "I want to be left alone. I want to live a normal life where people don't know what I've done, where I can sleep through the night without seeing their faces, where I'm just a regular nurse doing a regular job. You've taken that away from me." Benson spoke up quietly. "Doc, you saved that ranger's life. That counts for something." "It counted for my job," Sophie said bitterly, "which I was fine accepting as the price. What I'm not fine with is being forced back into a world I left for good reasons." Garrison's expression softened. "I'm sorry. I didn't think about it from that angle. I just saw someone hurting one of my people and I reacted." "I'm not one of your people anymore," Sophie said. "That's the point. I'm a civilian. I get to be a civilian. That was the deal." "You're right," Garrison conceded. "I overstepped. But Sophie, what they did to you was wrong. Surely you can see that." Sophie slumped into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "Of course it was wrong. But lots of things are wrong. Hospital administrators make budget-driven decisions that hurt people. Insurance companies deny necessary care. The whole system is broken. Me getting fired is just one tiny piece of a much bigger problem." "So what do you want?" Benson asked. "If you could wave a magic wand and fix this situation, what would it look like?" Sophie thought about that. What did she want? To go back to the way things were, invisible and underestimated? To accept reinstatement and spend the rest of her career being, quote, the decorated veteran instead of just Sophie? To leave Pinehurst entirely and start over somewhere else? "I want to finish what I started," she said slowly. "When I saved Captain Hayes, I wasn't trying to make a political statement or prove anything. I was just doing what needed to be done. But now that it's become this big public thing, maybe I can use it." Garrison leaned forward. "Use it how?" Bradford's transfer decision wasn't malicious. It was systemic. Hospitals operate on such thin margins that they're terrified of uninsured patients. That fear leads to decisions that prioritize money over lives. Sophie met Garrison's eyes. "What if instead of just getting my job back, we use this attention to change the actual protocols? Make it so the next time a doctor faces this choice, they're empowered to save the life first and deal with the paperwork later?" "Policy reform," Benson said thoughtfully. "That's ambitious." "You deployed helicopters," Sophie pointed out. "That's pretty ambitious too." Garrison smiled slightly. "Touché. So you want reinstatement with policy changes attached?" "I want meaningful change," Sophie clarified. "Not just for me, but for every medical professional who might face a similar situation. The system shouldn't force people to choose between doing the right thing and keeping their jobs." "That's going to require negotiation," Garrison warned. "Hospital administration, board of directors, probably legal teams. It won't be quick or easy." "I'm aware," Sophie stood, feeling more centered than she had in days. "But if you're going to make my past public and turn my termination into a cause, then let's actually make it count for something." Benson grinned. "That's the Doc Randall I remember. Never did anything halfway." They returned to the lobby, where the crowd had swelled even larger. News crews had arrived, setting up cameras near the entrance. Forrester looked on the verge of a breakdown, his phone constantly buzzing with what were probably increasingly frantic messages from the board. Sophie walked to the center of the lobby, the crowd parting to let her through. She caught Bethany's eye and saw her friend's encouraging nod. She saw Quinn give her a thumbs up. She saw Madison Foster watching with something like hope. "Mr. Forrester," Sophie said clearly, "I'll accept reinstatement on 3 conditions." The lobby went silent again. Forrester looked at her warily. "What conditions?" First, I want a formal review of the hospital's patient care protocols, specifically regarding emergency cases where insurance status might delay treatment. Second, I want protection written into policy for any medical staff who prioritize life-saving intervention over administrative approval in genuine emergency situations. And third, I want Captain Hayes' bill written off entirely. He nearly died because of an insurance verification policy. He shouldn't also be bankrupted by it. Forrester blinked rapidly, processing. Ms. Randall, those are significant demands. They're non-negotiable, Sophie said. You can fire me again if you want. But if you do, everyone here knows it's because you care more about protecting hospital revenue than actually helping people. Bradford looked apoplectic. This is blackmail. This is consequence, Dr. Carlson corrected. You made a decision that nearly killed a patient and did fire an exemplary employee. Sophie is giving you a chance to turn that mistake into positive change. I'd suggest you take it. Evelyn Sawyer stepped forward, her stern demeanor finally breaking into something warmer. I've been a nurse here for 22 years. In that time, I've seen administration make dozens of decisions that prioritize budgets over patients. Usually we just accept it because we need our jobs. But Sophie's right. This time we have leverage to actually change things. Mr. Forrester, if you don't accept her terms, you'll have a staff rebellion on your hands. Other voices chimed in agreement. The groundswell was unmistakable. The medical staff was rallying behind Sophie not just because they liked her, but because she was fighting for something they all believed in. Forrester pulled out his phone. I need to call the board chairman. This decision is above my authority. Make the call, Garrison said. We'll wait. Forrester disappeared into a side office. Bradford followed him, his face tight with anger. The crowd in the lobby waited with restless energy, some people sitting on benches, others standing in small clusters, everyone speculating about what would happen next. Sophie found herself surrounded by well-wishers, current staff, former patients, even a few people who'd just been in the hospital for other reasons but had gotten caught up in the drama. Bethany hugged her tightly. Quinn squeezed her shoulder. Madison Foster thanked her for showing what real courage looked like. Harriet Brennan tapped her cane on the floor to get Sophie's attention. Young lady, you did good. Don't let these administrators make you doubt that. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan, Sophie said quietly. 20 minutes later, Forrester emerged from the office. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sophie could see the tension in his shoulders. I've spoken with George Hammond, our board chairman, Forrester announced. After reviewing the situation, the board has agreed to Ms. Randall's terms with some modifications. We will reinstate her with full back pay and conduct a comprehensive review of our emergency care protocols. We will also establish a Good Samaritan provision protecting medical staff who act in genuine life-threatening emergencies, subject to peer review. And we will adjust Captain Hayes' billing to reflect his service to our country. A cheer went up from the gathered staff. Sophie felt relief and anxiety in equal measure. She'd gotten what she asked for, but now she had to live with the consequences. However, Forrester continued, we expect Ms. Randall to work with administration on the protocol review, not against us. This is a partnership, not a punishment. Agreed, Sophie said. Bradford stepped forward, his jaw tight. Ms. Randall, I owe you an apology. My decision to transfer Captain Hayes was based on hospital policy. But policy should never override clinical judgment in a genuine emergency. Your assessment was correct, and your intervention was appropriate. I should have trusted your expertise. The apology sounded forced, and Sophie suspected Bradford would never truly forgive her for making him look bad. But it was something. Thank you, Dr. Bradford, she said simply. Commander Garrison extended her hand to Sophie. Welcome back to the fight, Doc, and congratulations on using your leverage wisely. Sophie shook her hand, feeling the familiar firmness of a military grip. Thank you for having my back, Commander, even when I didn't ask for it. That's what teammates do, Garrison replied. She glanced around the crowded lobby, at the cameras and phones recording everything. You know this story is going to spread, right? You won't be anonymous anymore. I know, Sophie said, but maybe that's okay. Maybe I was hiding for the wrong reasons. As the crowd began to disperse, people returning to their normal hospital business, Sophie felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't the same person who'd walked out of this building 2 days ago. That Sophie had been running from her past, trying to be someone smaller and safer than who she actually was. This Sophie, the one standing in the lobby with military brass and supportive colleagues and news cameras, was done hiding. The helicopters on the lawn began to power up, their rotors accelerating. Garrison and her team prepared to depart, their mission accomplished. But before they left, Master Chief Benson pulled Sophie aside. "Doc, one more thing," he said quietly. "Commander Garrison meant what she said about the Navy wanting you back. If you ever change your mind about civilian life, there's a position waiting for you at our training command. Teaching the next generation of corpsmen, no deployments, no combat, just passing on what you know." Sophie considered that. The idea of teaching had never occurred to her, but it held a certain appeal. She could use her experience without having to live it again. "I'll think about it," she promised, "but for now I have work to do here." Benson nodded and rejoined his team. The military formation departed as precisely as they'd arrived, leaving the hospital staff to process what had just happened. Sophie stood at the window, watching the helicopters lift off, their powerful rotors kicking up dust and debris. They banked over the hospital, dipped their noses in a final salute, and flew off toward the east, returning to their base and their normal duties. Behind her, the hospital was returning to normal too, or at least to a new normal, where everyone knew exactly who Sophie Randall was and what she'd done, where she couldn't hide anymore but maybe didn't need to. Quinn appeared at her elbow grinning. "So boss, when do you want to start back?" Sophie turned from the window, a small smile playing at her lips. "Tomorrow, we have protocols to rewrite." As she walked through the ER toward the staff locker room, Sophie felt the weight of the last 3 years lifting slightly. She wasn't the same person who'd left the Navy, and she wasn't trying to be anymore. She was someone new, someone who'd learned to integrate both halves of her life into something stronger than either part alone. The ghosts had come home, and instead of destroying her, they'd set her free. Sophie returned to Pinehurst Medical Center the following morning, carrying a thermal coffee mug and wearing fresh scrubs that still smelled of laundry detergent. The parking lot was quieter than usual for a Wednesday, though she noticed several cars with news station logos idling near the entrance. Word had spread fast. One reporter even attempted to approach her before Security Chief Cooper intervened, politely but firmly redirecting the journalist to wait for the scheduled press conference later that afternoon. Inside, the atmosphere felt different. Staff members who'd previously ignored her now nodded respectfully as she passed. A few stopped to shake her hand or murmur words of support. Sophie accepted the attention with quiet grace, though it made her skin itch with discomfort. She'd spent 3 years cultivating invisibility. Being seen felt exposing in ways she hadn't anticipated. The ER was busy with morning admissions, a construction worker with a nail gun injury, an elderly woman with chest pain, a teenager who'd crashed his bicycle. Normal emergencies that required competent care but not heroics. Sophie fell into the familiar rhythm easily, checking vitals, updating charts, administering medications under physician supervision. Bethany materialized at her elbow during a brief lull. "How does it feel to be back?" "Strange," Sophie admitted, adjusting an IV pump. "Like I'm wearing someone else's clothes." "You mean someone else's reputation?" Bethany corrected gently. "Everyone knows now, Sophie, about your service. About what you can do. That's what makes it strange." Sophie moved to wash her hands at the sink, scrubbing methodically. "Before, people underestimated me. That was uncomfortable but manageable. Now they might overestimate me, which feels worse somehow." Quinn joined them, his tablet tucked under one arm. "Dr. Bradford wants to see you in his office. Something about the Protocol Review Committee." Sophie dried her hands and headed toward the administrative wing, her stomach tight with apprehension. Bradford's office was on the second floor, a modest space lined with medical textbooks and framed certifications. He sat behind his desk reviewing paperwork, his reading glasses perched on his nose, looking more tired than angry. "Nurse Randall," he said formally, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming." Sophie sat, waiting. Bradford set down his pen and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose in a gesture of exhaustion. "I've been directed by administration to chair the Protocol Review Committee," he began. "You'll serve as the primary clinical advisor, along with Dr. Carlson and 2 board members. Our mandate is to create comprehensive guidelines for emergency situations where insurance verification might delay critical care." "I understand," Sophie said. Bradford was quiet for a moment, studying her. You made me look incompetent in front of my entire department, in front of military brass and news cameras. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Sophie met his gaze steadily. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you, Dr. Bradford. I was trying to save a life." "I know," he sighed heavily. "That's what makes this so damn complicated. You were right. Medically, ethically, you were absolutely right. But you were also insubordinate, and that sets a dangerous precedent for hospital authority structures." "So what do we do about it?" Sophie asked. "We figure out how to create protocols that preserve necessary hierarchy while allowing for clinical judgment in genuine emergencies." Bradford leaned back in his chair. "It won't be easy. Every exception we create becomes a potential liability exposure. Every guideline we write will be scrutinized by legal counsel and insurance carriers." "But it's necessary," Sophie said. "Yes," Bradford agreed reluctantly. "It's necessary. Because what happened with Captain Hayes exposed a fundamental flaw in how we approach emergency care. We've become so risk-averse, so focused on protecting the institution, that we've lost sight of our primary mission." Sophie was surprised by his candor. "What changed your mind?" Bradford picked up a photograph from his desk. A young man in military dress uniform, smiling at the camera. "My son. He's a Marine infantry officer, currently deployed overseas. When I saw Captain Hayes bleeding in our ER, I saw an insurance liability. But my wife, she saw someone's son dying while we debated paperwork. She asked me what I'd want other doctors to do if our son showed up at their hospital bleeding and uninsured." He set the photograph down carefully. "I didn't have a good answer. That's when I realized my priorities had gotten twisted somewhere along the way." Sophie understood then that Bradford wasn't a villain. He was a man who'd spent so many years navigating hospital bureaucracy that he'd forgotten the simpler truths underneath. His wife's question had stripped away the administrative justifications and left him facing an uncomfortable reality. "Your son is lucky to have parents who care that much," Sophie said quietly. "He's lucky to have corpsmen like you watching out for him," Bradford replied. "That's what my wife said after she watched the news coverage. She said, 'Winston, that nurse probably saved a dozen boys like our son. And you fired her for it.'" The admission hung in the air between them. Sophie felt something shift in her understanding of Bradford. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that his choices had been more complicated than simple cruelty. "The protocol review starts Monday," Bradford continued, shifting back to professional territory. "I'll need your input on field triage standards, combat casualty care principles, anything that can help us create better guidelines." "I'll be there," Sophie promised. As she left his office, Sophie reflected on the strange complexity of the situation. Bradford had almost let Hayes die through institutional cowardice, yet he'd also been motivated by genuine concern for hospital sustainability. He'd fired her unjustly, yet he was now working to ensure the same injustice didn't happen to others. People weren't simple equations of good and evil. They were messy collections of competing priorities and imperfect choices. The morning passed in steady work. Sophie treated a child's fever, helped stabilize a diabetic emergency, and taught a nursing student the proper technique for wound irrigation. The rhythm was soothing, each task grounding her more firmly in the present. At noon, Malcolm Forrester appeared in the ER accompanied by two people Sophie didn't recognize, a distinguished older man in an expensive suit and a woman carrying a professional camera. "Ms. Randall," Forrester said with forced pleasantness, "this is George Hammond, our board chairman, and Amanda Sterling from Channel 7 News. They'd like to speak with you about yesterday's events." Sophie's first instinct was to refuse, but she recognized the political reality. The story was going to be told whether she participated or not. Better to have some control over the narrative. They convened in a small conference room. Hammond shook her hand firmly. "Ms. Randall, on behalf of the board, I want to personally thank you for the grace you've shown during this difficult situation. Your willingness to work with us on protocol reform rather than pursue legal action is appreciated." "I'm not interested in lawsuits," Sophie said. "I'm interested in making sure other medical professionals don't face the same impossible choice I did." Amanda Sterling, the reporter, leaned forward with professional interest. "Can you walk me through what you were thinking when Captain Hayes arrived? What made you decide to defy your supervisor's direct orders?" Sophie chose her words carefully. "I wasn't thinking about orders or policies. I was thinking that I had skills that could save a life, and about 10 minutes to use them. The choice wasn't between following rules or breaking them. It was between action and inaction. I chose action. Your military background clearly influenced that decision, Sterling pressed. In combat situations, there's no time for bureaucratic approval. Did you find civilian hospital protocols frustratingly slow? It was a trap question designed to make her criticize Pinehurst publicly. Sophie sidestepped it smoothly. Military and civilian medicine serve different purposes with different constraints. Combat medicine prioritizes immediate survival with limited resources. Hospital medicine prioritizes comprehensive care with extensive oversight. Both approaches have value. The challenge is finding the right balance. Hammond nodded approvingly at her diplomatic answer. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering her Navy service in broad strokes, her transition to civilian nursing, and her hopes for the protocol reforms. Sophie kept her responses measured and factual, refusing to be drawn into inflammatory statements about Bradford or hospital administration. When the interview concluded, Sterling thanked her and mentioned the segment would air that evening. Sophie felt drained by the performance of being publicly professional about something that had cost her so much emotional turmoil. Bethany found her in the break room afterward, staring at a cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. That looked intense. How'd it go? Like walking through a minefield while people applaud, Sophie said. Every question had 3 potential wrong answers. You handled it perfectly, Bethany assured her. Very poised and professional. Much better than I would have done. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor. Captain Logan Hayes appeared in the ER lobby, leaning on a cane but moving under his own power. His chest was still bandaged beneath his civilian shirt, but his color was good and his eyes clear. Quinn spotted him first and immediately came to find Sophie. Your patient is here, the Ranger. Sophie's heart rate kicked up slightly as she walked to the lobby. Hayes saw her approaching and straightened, a genuine smile breaking across his face. Nurse Randall, he said warmly, I was hoping to catch you. Captain Hayes, you should still be resting. I've been resting for 3 days. I needed to get out of that hospital bed. He gestured toward a quieter corner of the lobby. Can we talk for a minute? They sat in 2 chairs near the windows overlooking the parking lot where, just yesterday, Navy helicopters had landed. Hayes settled carefully into his seat, one hand pressed to his ribs. I wanted to thank you properly, he said. Without the chaos of yesterday, you saved my life. And then you got fired for it, and then the Navy showed up and made everything even more complicated. I feel responsible for all of it. You're not responsible, Sophie said firmly. You were unconscious for most of the important parts. I know, but still, Hayes shifted uncomfortably. When I woke up in the ICU, and they told me what happened, I made some calls. I didn't expect Commander Garrison to deploy helicopters. I just wanted someone to know that you'd been treated unfairly. The helicopters were definitely excessive, Sophie admitted, but they got results. Jessica, my sister, she told me you asked her not to make a fuss, that you wanted to move on quietly. Hayes met her eyes with earnest sincerity. I'm sorry I didn't respect that. I should have asked what you wanted instead of assuming you'd want public recognition. Sophie appreciated the apology more than she'd expected. You were trying to help, I understand that. And honestly, maybe the fuss was necessary. It forced conversations that needed to happen. The protocol changes? Hayes asked. Among other things. Sophie glanced around the busy ER. This place has been operating on fear for too long. Fear of lawsuits, fear of financial losses, fear of making mistakes. That fear was making people choose wrong. Sometimes you need a dramatic disruption to break through institutional inertia. Hayes smiled slightly. Spoken like someone who's planned more than a few military operations. I've seen what happens when rigid protocols override common sense, Sophie said. In combat, that gets people killed. Turns out it's not much different in civilian hospitals. They talked for a few more minutes about Hayes' recovery timeline and his plans to return to active duty once he was cleared. He mentioned his platoon was rotating back from a training exercise and would be in the area for another week. Then he pulled a business card from his pocket. My sister wanted me to give you this. She runs a non-profit that helps veterans transition to civilian careers. She thought you might be interested in connecting with other former military medical personnel. Sophie took the card, studying the simple design. Veterans First Career Network. An address in Raleigh. Thank you, I'll reach out. After Hayes left, Sophie stood at the window, watching him walk slowly to a car where his sister waited. Jessica Hayes waved at the hospital building, a gesture of gratitude that Sophie returned with a small smile. The rest of the week passed in a blur of work and meetings. The Protocol Review Committee convened for the first time on Monday, gathering in a conference room with whiteboards and coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. Sophie found herself presenting field triage principles to a group of administrators and physicians who'd never considered medicine outside sterile hospital environments. In combat situations, we use a system called tactical combat casualty care, she explained, drawing diagrams on the whiteboard. The basic principle is treating the most immediately life-threatening conditions first, regardless of other injuries. Massive hemorrhage, airway obstruction, tension pneumothorax. These kill fast. Everything else can wait. Dr. Carlson nodded along, his military background making him familiar with the concepts. Bradford listened intently, taking detailed notes. The board members looked slightly overwhelmed but engaged. The question, Sophie continued, is how we adapt that mindset to a civilian hospital, where we have more resources but also more regulatory constraints. We can't ignore insurance verification entirely, but we also can't let it delay treatment when minutes matter. The committee spent 3 hours that first day hammering out basic principles. They would create a tiered system, immediate intervention for life-threatening emergencies regardless of insurance status, rapid verification for urgent but non-critical cases, and standard procedures for non-emergency situations. Medical staff would be empowered to make life or death calls without administrative approval, subject to peer review afterward to prevent abuse. It was complicated, imperfect, and riddled with potential legal issues, but it was better than what they'd had before. Between committee meetings, Sophie worked her regular shifts. She noticed subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with her. Dr. Madison Foster sought her advice on complex cases, valuing her opinion in ways she hadn't before. Evelyn Sawyer, the formerly stern senior nurse, invited Sophie to join a weekend hiking group she organized for hospital staff. Even orderly Marcus Lee, who'd always been friendly but distant, started bringing her coffee during particularly hectic shifts. The recognition was simultaneously gratifying and uncomfortable. Sophie had to constantly remind herself that she wasn't fundamentally different than she'd been 2 weeks ago. The same skills that now earned respect had always been there, just unacknowledged. 10 days after her reinstatement, Sophie received an unexpected phone call during her lunch break. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was instantly recognizable. "Petty Officer Randall, this is Commander Garrison." Sophie straightened in her chair. "Commander, I wasn't expecting to hear from you again. I wanted to follow up on our conversation in Pinehurst. You mentioned being interested in meaningful change rather than just personal vindication. I've been thinking about that." Garrison paused. "How would you feel about consulting for the Navy? Helping us develop better transition programs for corpsmen leaving military service?" Sophie's pulse quickened. "Consulting how?" "Nothing that would require you to leave civilian life," Garrison clarified. "Maybe a few trips to San Diego or Bethesda throughout the year? Guest lectures at the Hospital Corpsman School. Developing curriculum that helps active-duty corpsmen understand what civilian medicine looks like and how to translate their skills appropriately." It was an appealing offer. Sophie could contribute to something larger than herself without sacrificing the civilian stability she'd fought to build. "I'd need to discuss it with my employer, make sure it wouldn't interfere with my responsibilities here." "Of course. Think it over and let me know. We're not in a rush. The program wouldn't launch until next fiscal year anyway." Garrison's tone softened slightly. "You were always one of my best, Doc. I'd like to keep you connected to the community, even if you're not active duty anymore." After the call ended, Sophie sat in the break room, turning the proposition over in her mind. 6 months ago, she'd have refused immediately, too afraid of being pulled back into a world she'd fled. Now, with both her military past and civilian present finally visible, the idea of bridging both worlds felt less threatening and more like an opportunity. That evening, Sophie drove to the Veterans Center, where she'd been volunteering sporadically for the past 2 years. It was a modest building downtown that offered counseling, job placement services, and social programs for local veterans. Sophie had mostly helped with their medical screening clinics. checking blood pressure, and basic health metrics for vets who couldn't afford regular doctor visits. Tonight there was a support group meeting for recently discharged service members struggling with transition. Sophie usually avoided these sessions, uncomfortable with the emotional rawness they exposed. But something drew her in this time. About 15 veterans sat in a circle, men and women ranging from early 20s to late 50s, representing every branch of service. The facilitator, Reverend Thomas Whitaker, welcomed Sophie and gestured to an empty chair. "We were just discussing the challenges of translating military experience into civilian terms," Reverend Whitaker explained. "A lot of folks here have incredible skills but struggle to communicate their value to civilian employers." A young man in his mid-20s spoke up. "I was an Army combat medic. I treated gunshot wounds, blast injuries, worked in field hospitals under fire. But when I apply for paramedic jobs, they ask if I have EMT certification. My military training doesn't count for the credential, even though I've done way more complex procedures than a civilian paramedic." Sophie leaned forward. "What's your name?" "Tyler Morrison," the young man replied. "Tyler, I had the same problem when I left the Navy. I was a Fleet Marine Force corpsman with 4 combat deployments, but civilian hospitals wanted to know if I had a bachelor's degree in nursing. The disconnect between military and civilian medical credentials is real and frustrating." "How'd you deal with it?" another veteran asked. "I went back to school," Sophie admitted. "Got my BSN through an accelerated program for military veterans. It was expensive and time-consuming, but it gave me the credential I needed to work in civilian hospitals. The frustrating part was that I already had the knowledge and skills. I just needed the piece of paper that proved it to people who didn't understand military training." The conversation expanded, with other veterans sharing similar stories. A former Air Force mechanic who couldn't get civilian aviation jobs without FAA certifications. A Navy electronics technician whose sophisticated radar training wasn't recognized by civilian employers. A Marine logistics officer whose extensive experience managing supply chains meant nothing without an MBA. "The system isn't set up to value what we bring," Tyler said bitterly. "They want credentials over competence." "Sometimes," Sophie agreed, "but not always. I found that once I got past the credential barrier, my military experience became an asset. Civilian colleagues might not understand exactly what I did, but they recognize that military training creates certain qualities: discipline, adaptability, ability to perform under pressure. Those things matter." Reverend Whitaker nodded. "Sophie's right. The key is finding ways to bridge the gap. To translate military experience into language civilian employers understand while also educating them about the value of military training." After the session ended, Tyler approached Sophie privately. "Can I ask you something? When you left the military, did you have nightmares? Trouble sleeping?" Sophie recognized the question beneath the question. "Yes. For about a year after I separated, I'd wake up multiple times a night. Loud noises made me jumpy. I had flashbacks during stressful situations." "Does it get better?" "It gets different," Sophie said honestly. "The nightmares became less frequent. The hypervigilance mellowed into regular vigilance. I learned coping strategies, exercise, routine, therapy when I needed it. But I won't lie to you, Tyler. There are still hard days. Days when I remember things I wish I could forget." "How do you deal with those days?" "I remind myself that the hard things I experienced made me capable of helping people in ways most others can't. The trauma sucks, but the skills that came from it are valuable. Finding meaning in the suffering doesn't erase it, but it makes it more bearable." Tyler nodded slowly, processing. "Thanks for being honest. Most people just tell me it'll be fine, that I need to move on. But it's not that simple." "No," Sophie agreed. "It's not that simple at all." Driving home that night, Sophie felt a sense of purpose crystallizing. She'd spent 3 years running from her military past, treating it as something to hide rather than integrate. But what if instead of hiding, she used her experience to help others navigate the same difficult transition? What if her value wasn't in being invisible, but in being visible in ways that opened doors for other veterans? The consulting offer from Commander Garrison suddenly made more sense. The protocol reforms at Pinehurst weren't just about institutional policy. They were about creating space for people with unconventional backgrounds to contribute their full capabilities. Both opportunities were part of the same larger mission, making systems more flexible and humane. Over the next 2 weeks, the Protocol Review Committee finalized their recommendations. The new guidelines were comprehensive but practical, creating clear tiers of emergency response with built-in flexibility for clinical judgment. Medical staff would receive additional training on rapid triage assessment. Administration would develop expedited insurance verification processes. Most importantly, the hospital would establish a patient advocacy fund to cover emergency care for uninsured individuals, while longer-term payment arrangements were negotiated. Captain Hayes's bill was the first to be processed through the new fund. His care was covered entirely, with a notation in the system crediting his military service. Hayes sent a handwritten thank you note to Sophie, mentioning that he'd been promoted and would be teaching at the Ranger School starting in the fall. The symmetry pleased Sophie, both of them moving into teaching roles, passing on hard-won knowledge to the next generation. Dr. Bradford presented the new protocols to the medical staff at a mandatory training session. Sophie sat in the back of the auditorium, watching Bradford explain the principles she'd helped develop. He was thorough and professional, giving appropriate credit to the committee's work without dwelling on the incident that had necessitated the changes. During the Q&A session, a younger physician asked the obvious question: what happens if we make the wrong call? If we intervene in an emergency that turns out not to be as critical as we thought? Bradford didn't hesitate. Then you'll be reviewed by your peers, just like any other clinical decision. But I'll tell you something I learned recently. Being wrong while trying to save a life is forgivable. Not trying because you're afraid of being wrong is not. These new protocols are designed to protect you when you make good faith clinical decisions, even if the outcome isn't perfect. After the training, several staff members approached Sophie to discuss implementation details. The attention still felt strange, but she was getting better at accepting it. Dr. Foster mentioned that nursing students had started asking specifically to shadow Sophie during ER rotations, wanting to learn from someone with her background. "You're becoming kind of legendary around here," Foster said with a grin. "The nurse who defied the chief of medicine and got the whole system changed." "That's a dramatic oversimplification," Sophie protested. "Maybe, but it's a good story. And sometimes good stories inspire people to be braver than they thought they could be." 1 month after the helicopter incident, Pinehurst Medical Center held a small ceremony to officially adopt the new emergency care protocols. Local media were invited, along with representatives from the State Medical Board and several veterans organizations. Malcolm Forrester gave a speech about the hospital's commitment to patient-centered care and institutional flexibility. Sophie stood off to the side, uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing the importance of the moment. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were real. They would make a difference for future patients and future medical professionals facing impossible choices. Captain Logan Hayes attended the ceremony in dress uniform, along with his sister Jessica and 2 members of his Ranger platoon. They presented Sophie with a framed Ranger tab and a letter of appreciation signed by Hayes's commanding officer. Sophie accepted it with quiet grace, though her hands trembled slightly holding the military memorabilia. After the formal ceremony concluded, Hayes pulled her aside. "My CO asked me to pass along a message. He said any hospital that employs you is lucky to have you, and any unit that trained you should be proud." "That's kind of him," Sophie said. "He meant it." Hayes studied her face. "You look different than when I first met you in the ER. More settled, maybe, like you figured something out." Sophie considered that. "I think I stopped trying to be 2 different people, the military version and the civilian version. I'm just one person now. Both things at once." "That's good," Hayes said. "That's healthy." As the ceremony attendees mingled over coffee and cookies, Sophie found herself in conversation with George Hammond, the hospital board chairman. He'd been mostly silent during the protocol development process, but now he seemed genuinely interested in her perspective. "Ms. Randall, I've been thinking about your unique position here," Hammond said. "You bring something to this hospital that we didn't even know we were missing. A bridge between military and civilian medicine. Have you considered formalizing that role?" "Formalizing how?" "A position focused on veteran care coordination and military liaison services. Pinehurst serves a significant veteran population, but we don't have anyone specifically dedicated to understanding their unique needs. You could develop programs, train staff on military culture, help veterans navigate the healthcare system." It was an intriguing proposal. Sophie had been feeling constrained by regular floor nursing lately, sensing there was something larger she could contribute. What would that look like practically? Split role, Hammond suggested, half clinical nursing, half program development. You'd have budget authority to build something meaningful. And honestly, it would be good for the hospital's community relations. People remember what happened here. They remember that we fired a veteran for saving a life. Creating a veteran-focused program would demonstrate genuine commitment to making amends. Sophie appreciated his honesty about the PR motivations, even if they weren't the most noble reasons. I'd want input from actual veterans, not just administrative decisions about what we think they need. Absolutely. We could establish an advisory board, bring in representatives from local veteran organizations, make it collaborative. Then I'm interested, Sophie said. Let me think about the specifics and get back to you. That evening, Sophie sat in her apartment with a notepad, sketching out ideas. A veteran health navigation program. Peer support groups led by former military medical personnel. Transition assistance for service members separating from active duty. Training for civilian medical staff on military culture and combat-related health issues. The scope was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. But Sophie had learned that meaningful change required ambition. Playing it safe meant accepting systems that didn't work. Her phone rang. Commander Garrison's name appeared on the screen. "Commander," Sophie answered. "I heard about Pinehurst's ceremony today," Garrison said. "Congratulations on the protocol implementation. That's significant work." "It's a start," Sophie said. "There's more to do." "There always is. Listen, I wanted to follow up on my consulting offer. Have you had time to think about it?" Sophie glanced at her notepad covered in ideas. "I have. And I'd like to accept, with one addition. I want to develop a formal partnership between the Navy's corpsman community and Pinehurst's new Veteran Services Program. Create a pipeline for corpsmen transitioning out of service, help them get civilian credentials, connect them with employment opportunities, provide mentorship from people who've made the transition successfully." Garrison was quiet for a moment. "That's more ambitious than what I proposed." "I know, but it addresses a real gap. Too many talented corpsmen leave the service and struggle to find their place in civilian medicine. If we can smooth that transition, we help them, and we help civilian healthcare systems that benefit from their expertise. You'd need significant buy-in from both military and civilian leadership," Garrison warned. "I'm aware, but I think I have some credibility now. With both communities." Garrison laughed quietly. "You certainly made an impression. All right, let's pursue it. Send me a formal proposal, and I'll start working the bureaucracy on my end." After the call ended, Sophie sat back and looked around her apartment. The sparse space that had felt like hiding now felt like potential, a launching point rather than a refuge. She wasn't the same person who'd fled the Navy 3 years ago, desperate for anonymity and peace. She'd found peace, but not through hiding. Through integration. Through accepting all parts of herself, instead of compartmentalizing. The next morning, Sophie met with Malcolm Forrester and George Hammond to discuss the Veteran Services Program. She brought her notepad filled with ideas and a rough budget projection. They spent 2 hours reviewing the proposal, adjusting scope, identifying funding sources. By the end of the meeting, they'd outlined a pilot program that could launch within 3 months. "You've put serious thought into this," Hammond observed. "I have 3 years of suppressed ideas," Sophie said with a slight smile. "Now seems like a good time to let them out." Forrester looked at her with something approaching respect. "You know, when I fired you, I thought I was protecting the hospital from liability. Turned out I was protecting us from innovation. That was short-sighted." "You were doing what made sense within the framework you had," Sophie said diplomatically. "Sometimes frameworks need to change." Over the following weeks, Sophie began building the Veteran Services Program while maintaining her clinical duties. She recruited Tyler Morrison, the young Army medic from the support group, as a program assistant. Together they conducted outreach to local veterans organizations, developed training materials for hospital staff, and created resource guides for veterans navigating healthcare systems. The work was exhausting, but fulfilling in ways Sophie hadn't experienced since leaving the Navy. She was using every part of herself: clinical skills, leadership experience, understanding of both military and civilian cultures. Nothing was wasted anymore. Dr. Bradford, surprisingly, became an unexpected ally. His son had returned from deployment and visited Pinehurst during his leave, spending an afternoon talking with Sophie about combat medicine. The experience seemed to soften Bradford's remaining resentment. He started referring complex veteran patients specifically to Sophie, trusting her to understand their unique needs. "I misjudged you," Bradford admitted one afternoon when they were both reviewing patient charts. "I saw someone unwilling to follow hierarchy. I didn't see someone with a different kind of expertise trying to apply it appropriately." "You weren't entirely wrong," Sophie said. "I was insubordinate by hospital standards. The question was whether that insubordination was justified by the circumstances." "It was," Bradford said. "I know that now. Though it cost me considerable professional embarrassment to learn it." "Growth is usually uncomfortable," Sophie observed. Bradford smiled wryly. "That's the understatement of the year." 3 months after her reinstatement, Sophie gave a presentation at the Navy Hospital Corpsman School in Fort Sam, Houston, Texas. Commander Garrison had arranged the visit as part of their consulting agreement. Sophie stood before 200 corpsmen in training, many of them barely 20 years old, and talked about the reality of transitioning from military to civilian life. "You're learning skills that will serve you for life," she told them, "but you're also learning them in a context that civilian employers might not understand. When you eventually separate from service, you'll face a gap between what you can do and what credentials say you can do. My advice is to start planning for that transition now. Understand what civilian equivalents exist for your military training. Get certified in civilian standards while you're still active duty if possible. And don't be afraid to advocate for yourselves. Your training is valuable, even if civilian systems don't automatically recognize it." During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand. "How do you deal with people who don't respect military medical training? Who assume civilian credentials are automatically superior?" Sophie thought carefully about her answer. "You prove them wrong through your work. Not by being defensive or argumentative, but by demonstrating competence consistently." Eventually, most reasonable people recognize quality, regardless of where it came from. And for the unreasonable people who will never value military training, you can't change their minds, so don't waste energy trying. Focus on the ones who are open to learning. Tyler nodded slowly, processing. "Thanks for being honest. Most people just tell me it'll be fine, that I need to move on. But it's not that simple." "No," Sophie agreed. "It's not that simple at all." Driving home that night, Sophie felt a sense of purpose crystallizing. She'd spent 3 years running from her military past, treating it as something to hide rather than integrate. But what if instead of hiding, she used her experience to help others navigate the same difficult transition? What if her value wasn't in being invisible, but in being visible in ways that opened doors for other veterans? The consulting offer from Commander Garrison suddenly made more sense. The protocol reforms at Pinehurst weren't just about institutional policy. They were about creating space for people with unconventional backgrounds to contribute their full capabilities. Both opportunities were part of the same larger mission, making systems more flexible and humane. Over the next 2 weeks, the Protocol Review Committee finalized their recommendations. The new guidelines were comprehensive but practical, creating clear tiers of emergency response with built-in flexibility for clinical judgment. Medical staff would receive additional training on rapid triage assessment. Administration would develop expedited insurance verification processes. Most importantly, the hospital would establish a patient advocacy fund to cover emergency care for uninsured individuals, while longer-term payment arrangements were negotiated. Captain Hayes's bill was the first to be processed through the new fund. His care was covered entirely, with a notation in the system crediting his military service. Hayes sent a handwritten thank you note to Sophie, mentioning that he'd been promoted and would be teaching at the Ranger School starting in the fall. The symmetry pleased Sophie, both of them moving into teaching roles, passing on hard-won knowledge to the next generation. Dr. Bradford presented the new protocols to the medical staff at a mandatory training session. Sophie sat in the back of the auditorium, watching Bradford explain the principles she'd helped develop. He was thorough and professional, giving appropriate credit to the committee's work without dwelling on the incident that had necessitated the changes. During the Q&A session, a younger physician asked the obvious question: what happens if we make the wrong call? If we intervene in an emergency that turns out not to be as critical as we thought? Bradford didn't hesitate. Then you'll be reviewed by your peers, just like any other clinical decision. But I'll tell you something I learned recently. Being wrong while trying to save a life is forgivable. Not trying because you're afraid of being wrong is not. These new protocols are designed to protect you when you make good faith clinical decisions, even if the outcome isn't perfect. After the training, several staff members approached Sophie to discuss implementation details. The attention still felt strange, but she was getting better at accepting it. Dr. Foster mentioned that nursing students had started asking specifically to shadow Sophie during ER rotations, wanting to learn from someone with her background. "You're becoming kind of legendary around here," Foster said with a grin. "The nurse who defied the chief of medicine and got the whole system changed." "That's a dramatic oversimplification," Sophie protested. "Maybe, but it's a good story. And sometimes good stories inspire people to be braver than they thought they could be." 1 month after the helicopter incident, Pinehurst Medical Center held a small ceremony to officially adopt the new emergency care protocols. Local media were invited, along with representatives from the State Medical Board and several veterans organizations. Malcolm Forrester gave a speech about the hospital's commitment to patient-centered care and institutional flexibility. Sophie stood off to the side, uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing the importance of the moment. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were real. They would make a difference for future patients and future medical professionals facing impossible choices. Captain Logan Hayes attended the ceremony in dress uniform, along with his sister Jessica and 2 members of his Ranger platoon. They presented Sophie with a framed Ranger tab and a letter of appreciation signed by Hayes's commanding officer. Sophie accepted it with quiet grace, though her hands trembled slightly holding the military memorabilia. After the formal ceremony concluded, Hayes pulled her aside. "My CO asked me to pass along a message. He said any hospital that employs you is lucky to have you, and any unit that trained you should be proud." "That's kind of him," Sophie said. "He meant it." Hayes studied her face. "You look different than when I first met you in the ER. More settled, maybe, like you figured something out." Sophie considered that. "I think I stopped trying to be 2 different people. The military version and the civilian version. I'm just one person now. Both things at once." "That's good," Hayes said. "That's healthy." As the ceremony attendees mingled over coffee and cookies, Sophie found herself in conversation with George Hammond, the hospital board chairman. He'd been mostly silent during the protocol development process, but now he seemed genuinely interested in her perspective. "Ms. Randall, I've been thinking about your unique position here," Hammond said. "You bring something to this hospital that we didn't even know we were missing. A bridge between military and civilian medicine. Have you considered formalizing that role?" "Formalizing how?" "A position focused on veteran care coordination and military liaison services. Pinehurst serves a significant veteran population, but we don't have anyone specifically dedicated to understanding their unique needs. You could develop programs, train staff on military culture, help veterans navigate the healthcare system." It was an intriguing proposal. Sophie had been feeling constrained by regular floor nursing lately, sensing there was something larger she could contribute. What would that look like practically? "Split role," Hammond suggested, "half clinical nursing, half program development. You'd have budget authority to build something meaningful. And honestly, it would be good for the hospital's community relations. People remember what happened here. They remember that we fired a veteran for saving a life. Creating a veteran-focused program would demonstrate genuine commitment to making amends." Sophie appreciated his honesty about the PR motivations, even if they weren't the most noble reasons. "I'd want input from actual veterans, not just administrative decisions about what we think they need." "Absolutely. We could establish an advisory board, bring in representatives from local veteran organizations, make it collaborative." "Then I'm interested," Sophie said. "Let me think about the specifics and get back to you." That evening, Sophie sat in her apartment with a notepad, sketching out ideas. A veteran health navigation program, peer support groups led by former military medical personnel, transition assistance for service members separating from active duty, training for civilian medical staff on military culture and combat-related health issues. The scope was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. But Sophie had learned that meaningful change required ambition. Playing it safe meant accepting systems that didn't work. Her phone rang. Commander Garrison's name appeared on the screen. "Commander," Sophie answered. "I heard about Pinehurst's ceremony today," Garrison said. "Congratulations on the protocol implementation. That's significant work." It's a start, Sophie said. There's more to do. There always is. Listen, I wanted to follow up on my consulting offer. Have you had time to think about it? Sophie glanced at her notepad covered in ideas. I have. And I'd like to accept, with one addition. I want to develop a formal partnership between the Navy's corpsman community and Pinehurst's new Veteran Services program. Create a pipeline for corpsmen transitioning out of service, help them get civilian credentials, connect them with employment opportunities, provide mentorship from people who've made the transition successfully. Garrison was quiet for a moment. That's more ambitious than what I proposed. I know, but it addresses a real gap. Too many talented corpsmen leave the service and struggle to find their place in civilian medicine. If we can smooth that transition, we help them, and we help civilian healthcare systems that benefit from their expertise. You'd need significant buy-in from both military and civilian leadership, Garrison warned. I'm aware, but I think I have some credibility now. With both communities. Garrison laughed quietly. You certainly made an impression. All right, let's pursue it. Send me a formal proposal, and I'll start working the bureaucracy on my end. After the call ended, Sophie sat back and looked around her apartment. The sparse space that had felt like hiding now felt like potential, a launching point rather than a refuge. She wasn't the same person who'd fled the Navy 3 years ago, desperate for anonymity and peace. She'd found peace, but not through hiding. Through integration. Through accepting all parts of herself, instead of compartmentalizing. The next morning, Sophie met with Malcolm Forrester and George Hammond to discuss the Veteran Services Program. She brought her notepad filled with ideas and a rough budget projection. They spent 2 hours reviewing the proposal, adjusting scope, identifying funding sources. By the end of the meeting, they'd outlined a pilot program that could launch within 3 months. You've put serious thought into this, Hammond observed. I have 3 years of suppressed ideas, Sophie said with a slight smile. Now seems like a good time to let them out. Forrester looked at her with something approaching respect. You know, when I fired you, I thought I was protecting the hospital from liability. Turned out I was protecting us from innovation. That was short-sighted. You were doing what made sense within the framework you had, Sophie said diplomatically. Sometimes frameworks need to change. Over the following weeks, Sophie began building the Veteran Services Program while maintaining her clinical duties. She recruited Tyler Morrison, the young Army medic from the support group, as a program assistant. Together they conducted outreach to local veterans, organizations, developed training materials for hospital staff, and created resource guides for veterans navigating healthcare systems. The work was exhausting, but fulfilling in ways Sophie hadn't experienced since leaving the Navy. She was using every part of herself: clinical skills, leadership experience, understanding of both military and civilian cultures. Nothing was wasted anymore. Dr. Bradford, surprisingly, became an unexpected ally. His son had returned from deployment and visited Pinehurst during his leave, spending an afternoon talking with Sophie about combat medicine. The experience seemed to soften Bradford's remaining resentment. He started referring complex veteran patients specifically to Sophie, trusting her to understand their unique needs. I misjudged you, Bradford admitted one afternoon when they were both reviewing patient charts. I saw someone unwilling to follow hierarchy. I didn't see someone with a different kind of expertise trying to apply it appropriately. You weren't entirely wrong, Sophie said. I was insubordinate by hospital standards. The question was whether that insubordination was justified by the circumstances. It was, Bradford said. I know that now. Though it cost me considerable professional embarrassment to learn it. Growth is usually uncomfortable, Sophie observed. Bradford smiled wryly. That's the understatement of the year. 3 months after her reinstatement, Sophie gave a presentation at the Navy Hospital Corpsman School in Fort Sam, Houston, Texas. Commander Garrison had arranged the visit as part of their consulting agreement. Sophie stood before 200 corpsmen in training, many of them barely 20 years old, and talked about the reality of transitioning from military to civilian life. You're learning skills that will serve you for life, she told them, but you're also learning them in a context that civilian employers might not understand. When you eventually separate from service, you'll face a gap between what you can do and what credentials say you can do. My advice is to start planning for that transition now. Understand what civilian equivalents exist for your military training. Get certified in civilian standards while you're still active duty if possible. And don't be afraid to advocate for yourselves. Your training is valuable, even if civilian systems don't automatically recognize it. During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand. How do you deal with people who don't respect military medical training? Who assume civilian credentials are automatically superior? Sophie thought carefully about her answer. You prove them wrong through your work. Not by being defensive or argumentative, but by demonstrating competence consistently. Eventually, most reasonable people recognize quality, regardless of where it came from. And for the unreasonable people who will never value military training, you can't change their minds, so don't waste energy trying. Focus on the ones who are open to learning. After the presentation, several corpsmen approached her privately to discuss their specific situations. Sophie listened to each one, offering advice based on her own difficult transition. She exchanged contact information with a dozen people who wanted ongoing mentorship. By the end of the day, she felt both drained and energized, the particular exhaustion that comes from meaningful work. Garrison met her for dinner that evening at a restaurant near the base. You did well today. Those kids needed to hear from someone who's actually made the transition successfully. I'm not sure I'd call my transition successful, Sophie said. I struggled for a long time. But you made it through, Garrison pointed out. You built a civilian career, found your place, and you're now creating programs to help others do the same. That's the definition of successful transition. They talked about the larger partnership proposal over dinner. Garrison had gotten preliminary approval from Navy leadership to develop a formal transition program for separating corpsmen. Pinehurst would serve as the pilot site, with potential expansion to other civilian hospitals if the model proved effective. We're calling it the Corpsman to Civilian Healthcare Bridge Program, Garrison explained. It'll provide transition training, credential assistance, job placement support, and ongoing mentorship. Your Veteran Services program at Pinehurst will be the civilian anchor point. Sophie felt excitement building despite herself. When does it launch? Officially next fiscal year. But we can start informal groundwork now. Identify separating corpsmen who might be good candidates. Develop relationships with other civilian healthcare systems. Create the curriculum. This is going to be bigger than I expected, Sophie said. Good things usually are. Garrison studied her across the table. You know, when you left the Navy, I thought you were making a mistake. I thought you were wasting your potential in some nowhere civilian job. I was wrong. You needed the civilian experience to understand both worlds well enough to bridge them. Your path made sense even if I couldn't see it at the time. Thank you for saying that, Sophie said quietly. Your disappointment when I separated was hard to carry. I'm sorry for making it harder, Garrison said. I should have supported your decision instead of questioning it. They parted with mutual respect and clearer understanding than they'd ever had during Sophie's active duty years. The relationship had evolved from commander and subordinate to colleagues working toward shared goals. The change felt right. Back in Pinehurst, life continued its new rhythm. Sophie split her time between clinical nursing and program development, finding satisfaction in both roles. The Veteran Services program grew steadily, serving more patients each month and attracting attention from other hospitals interested in replicating the model. Captain Hayes visited occasionally when his Ranger School duties brought him near Pinehurst. They'd developed an easy friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of military culture. Hayes sometimes brought other soldiers who were considering medical careers, introducing them to Sophie as an example of what was possible after service. 6 months after the helicopter incident, Sophie received an unexpected letter from Dr. Winston Bradford's wife, Catherine. They'd never met, but Catherine had watched the news coverage and wanted to reach out personally. Thank you for saving that young man's life, Catherine wrote. And thank you for forcing my husband to remember why he became a doctor in the first place. Winston's been so focused on administration and politics for so long that he'd lost touch with the actual mission of medicine. What happened with you reminded him that saving lives matters more than protecting institutions. He's been a better physician since then, and a better person. Sophie showed the letter to Bethany over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. I didn't expect that. You changed more than just protocols, Bethany observed. You changed how people think about their work. That's rare. Sophie looked around the busy cafeteria. Doctors and nurses and support staff all taking brief breaks from the endless work of healthcare. Each person had their own story, their own reasons for being here, their own struggles with balancing idealism and reality. "I don't think I changed anything," Sophie said slowly. "I just refused to accept that we had to choose between doing what's right and keeping our jobs." That refusal created space for others to question things they'd been accepting without examination. "That's what changing things looks like," Bethany said. As spring turned to summer, the Corpsman to Civilian Healthcare Bridge program officially launched with 15 participants. Tyler Morrison was among them, transitioning from his support group attendance to program coordinator, helping design services based on his own needs as a recently separated veteran. The local news did a follow-up story 1 year after the helicopter incident, documenting the changes at Pinehurst and profiling several veterans who'd benefited from the new programs. Sophie participated reluctantly in the interview, still uncomfortable with public attention but recognizing its value for promoting the work. "A year ago, I was fired for making a decision that violated hospital protocol," she told the camera. "Today, that same decision-making framework is built into our emergency care guidelines. That's not because I was special or heroic. It's because institutions can change when they're willing to examine their priorities honestly. Pinehurst did that hard work, and now they're better positioned to serve everyone who comes through their doors." The story aired during evening news and generated renewed interest in the Veterans Services Program. Donations to the Patient Advocacy Fund increased significantly. Other hospitals reached out asking for consultation on developing similar programs. The ripple effects continued spreading outward in ways Sophie couldn't have anticipated. On a warm August evening, Sophie sat on her apartment's small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Garrison. 3 more hospitals want to join the Bridge program. This is becoming something significant." Sophie smiled and texted back, "Good, that was always the point." She thought about the journey of the past year, from anonymous nurse to reluctantly public veteran advocate. From hiding her military past to using it as a foundation for helping others. From believing she had to choose between her 2 identities to understanding they were strongest together. The challenge coin sat on her coffee table inside, no longer hidden in a box but displayed openly alongside photos of her current life, military and civilian, past and present, all integrated into one coherent whole. Sophie Randall had stopped running from her ghosts. Instead, she'd invited them to sit beside her and help build something new. And in that reconciliation, she'd found not just peace, but purpose. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple. Tomorrow, she'd return to the hospital, treat patients, develop programs, mentor transitioning veterans, and continue the work of bridging divided worlds. But tonight, she simply sat in the gathering darkness, feeling genuinely at peace for the first time in years. The ghosts had come home, and home, it turned out, was exactly where they belonged. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.